The landing was silent, and that silence would haunt the battlefield for months. In the early hours along the Italian coast, Allied troops stepped ashore, expecting speed, surprise, and open roads leading straight toward Rome. The sea was calm, resistance was light. For a brief, fragile moment, it looked as though the war in Italy might finally break open. But at Anzio, hesitation proved deadlier than gunfire, and opportunity slipped away before anyone realized it was gone. The Battle of Anzio was born from urgency. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had slowed to a crawl. Mountains, rivers, and hardened German defenses turned every mile into a struggle. To break the deadlock, planners conceived Operation Shingle, a bold amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines. The idea was simple: land fast, move inland, cut supply routes, and force the German front to collapse. But war is rarely kind to simple ideas. When the landing succeeded with minimal opposition, commanders faced a decision that would define everything that followed: push forward immediately or consolidate and wait. Caution won. The beachhead dug in. And while Allied forces hesitated, the enemy did not. German units moved with speed and purpose. Artillery rolled into position. Infantry sealed off exits. The high ground was taken. What could have been a breakout became a trap, a narrow stretch of land under constant observation, surrounded by enemy forces who now had time to prepare. The beaches that had promised momentum turned into a killing ground. Anzio became a siege in reverse. Instead of besieging a city, the Allies found themselves besieged on the coast. German artillery ranged every road and position. Shelling came day and night. There was no safe rear area, no moment where the ground felt secure. Trenches filled with water, casualties mounted from bombardment as much as from assault. For the soldiers trapped inside the perimeter, Anzio was relentless. Mud replaced sand. Sleep vanished under constant fire. Movement meant drawing attention from guns already aimed. Counterattacks slammed into the line with ferocity. German forces probed, pressed, and nearly succeeded in driving the Allies back into the sea. At moments, the situation teetered on collapse, saved only by stubborn defense and overwhelming firepower poured into a space barely large enough to contain it. Weeks turned into months. The beachhead did not move. The cost kept rising, and Rome remained out of reach. Anzio earned a reputation as one of the most psychologically punishing battles of the war, not because of dramatic breakthroughs, but because of waiting under fire, knowing the chance for escape had once existed and was now gone. When the breakout finally came, it did not unfold as planned. Momentum was regained, but coordination faltered. Opportunities slipped again. German forces withdrew in good order, preserving much of their strength. Rome would fall, but not because Anzio had unfolded cleanly. The Battle of Anzio matters because it exposes the thin line between boldness and caution. It shows how surprise without speed can become vulnerability, how indecision can turn success into endurance, how modern war punishes hesitation just as brutally as recklessness. Anzio was not a failure, but it was not the victory it was meant to be. It became something else, a warning written in mud, steel, and time. Tonight, we return to that narrow stretch of coast, to the quiet landing that became a thunderstorm of steel, to the trenches where survival meant patience under fire, to the battle where opportunity knocked once and never returned. This is the story of the Battle of Anzio, and before we continue, I want to speak to you directly. If you're still here, listening all the way through, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, focus, or find calm in stories that deserve patience, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. Subscribing doesn't just support the channel, it keeps this kind of thoughtful, atmospheric storytelling alive. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the Battle of Anzio, November 1943. A British field hospital near Cassino, Italy. The surgeon's hands trembled not from fear, but from cold. Outside, snow fell on soldiers who had marched from Sicily expecting Mediterranean warmth. Inside, the operating table held another case of trench foot, the fourth that hour. The medic assisting him whispered what everyone was thinking. This was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe. Instead, it had become a frozen hell where men lost toes to frostbite faster than bullets. The Gustav Line, they called it. 100 miles of German fortifications that had turned the Italian peninsula into a meat grinder. Every yard north cost blood, and winter had only made the arithmetic worse. The promise had been simple, almost seductive in its logic. Invade Italy, topple Mussolini, and Germany's southern flank would collapse like a house of cards. Churchill himself had sold the strategy to Roosevelt and Stalin, painting vivid pictures of Allied armies sweeping through the soft underbelly, while Hitler bled divisions defending France. The landings at Salerno in September 1943 seemed to confirm his vision. American and British troops establishing beachheads, pushing inland, liberating Naples. But then they hit the mountains. The Apennines rose like a wall, and behind every ridge, every river, every medieval village, the Germans waited. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had transformed geography into fortress, and by December, the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl measured in hundreds of yards per week. General Mark Clark commanded the American Fifth Army, and the numbers haunting his sleep told a story of strategic failure. 16,000 casualties in 6 weeks, 70 miles gained in 4 months of fighting. His divisions were bleeding out against prepared positions where German machine gunners could hold off entire battalions. The Gustav Line anchored itself on Monte Cassino, a 1,500-year-old monastery crowning a mountain that dominated every approach. Artillery spotters in that abbey could direct fire on anything that moved for miles. Clark's intelligence officers estimated it would take 6 months and cost 50,000 men to break through, and even then, they weren't certain it could be done. Meanwhile, planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was consuming resources he desperately needed in Italy. Winston Churchill paced his war room on December 20th, 1943, studying maps that showed the brutal reality. Colored pins marked the front lines, barely moved since October. His doctors had warned him about stress, but how could he rest when young men were dying for nothing in Italian mud? He had promised Stalin a second front to relieve pressure on Russia. He had promised Roosevelt that Italy would draw German divisions away from France. Instead, the campaign was devouring Allied strength while achieving virtually nothing. In a cable to his commanders, he used a phrase that would become infamous. "We are stuck like a rat in a trap." The Italian campaign, his strategic brainchild, was becoming his strategic nightmare. Something had to change, and change radically. The problem was brutally simple. Frontal assault against prepared mountain defenses meant slaughter. The terrain favored defenders absolutely. German engineers had blown every bridge, mined every road, and positioned artillery to cover every valley. The winter of 1943 brought rain that turned battlefields into swamps, then cold that froze soldiers in their foxholes. Trenchfoot, pneumonia, and dysentery hospitalized as many men as German bullets. British Eighth Army to the east faced identical conditions: mountains, mud, and entrenched Germans who could kill 10 attackers for every defender lost. The mathematics were unsustainable. At current casualty rates, the Allied armies in Italy would be combat ineffective by spring, achieving nothing except their own destruction. Yet abandoning Italy wasn't an option either. Stalin demanded action. If the Western Allies appeared to be stalling while Russia bled, the political consequences could shatter the alliance. American public opinion, already skeptical about the Europe First strategy, wouldn't tolerate an endless stalemate. And practically hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tons of equipment sat in Italy with nowhere else to go. The invasion of France wasn't scheduled until May 1944 at the earliest. The landing craft, the supplies, the men. They were all committed to the Mediterranean theater. Retreat would hand Hitler a propaganda victory and waste months of sacrifice. The Allies needed a breakthrough, not just for military reasons, but for political survival of the coalition itself. Churchill's answer came during a meeting on January 8, 1944, when General Dwight Eisenhower prepared to depart for England to plan Overlord. The Prime Minister spread his hands across a map of Italy, fingers pointing to the coastline behind German lines. "We must have a cat claw, not a bullhorn," he declared. Instead of battering head-on against the Gustav line, what if they simply went around it? An amphibious landing behind German defenses could unhinge the entire front, land at Anzio, a beach town 33 miles south of Rome and 60 miles behind enemy lines. Cut the highways, threaten the capital, force Kesselring to abandon his mountain fortress, or risk encirclement. It was bold, it was risky, and it bore uncomfortable similarities to Churchill's World War I disaster at Gallipoli. But desperation breeds daring, and Italy had become desperate. The strategic logic appeared sound on paper. Anzio sat perfectly positioned to cut Highway 6 and Highway 7, the two main routes supplying German forces at the Gustav line. A strong landing force could sever those arteries, forcing a German retreat or surrounding their armies. Meanwhile, Fifth Army would attack at Cassino simultaneously, pinning German reserves. Caught between hammer and anvil, Kesselring's forces would have to either withdraw north of Rome or face destruction. The plan promised everything Italy had lacked: speed, surprise, decisive results. Churchill envisioned Allied troops in Rome within days, then pushing toward northern Italy, while Germany reeled from the double blow. The soft underbelly strategy would be vindicated, Italy would be liberated, and the Mediterranean campaign could end before Overlord began. But reality intruded on the planning with cruel efficiency. Landing craft, the lifeblood of any amphibious operation, were desperately scarce. Most were already allocated to Overlord, and those available in the Mediterranean had to be returned to England by early February for Normandy preparations. That meant any Anzio operation had to be mounted quickly and supplied through a single port, the beachhead itself. There would be no time for buildup, no gradual accumulation of overwhelming force. Whatever landed on day 1 would be largely what fought on day 30. Intelligence estimates suggested only 2 German battalions, roughly 1,500 men, defended the Anzio area. That seemed manageable. What the intelligence couldn't show, was how fast Germany could react. How quickly could Kesselring redirect divisions? How many troops could he pull from other sectors? Those questions had answers, but the Allies wouldn't learn them until it was too late. By mid-January 1944, Operation Shingle, the Anzio landing, had evolved from Churchill's vision to operational orders. The force would consist of 36,000 men in the initial assault, American 3rd Infantry Division, British 1st Division, Rangers, Commandos, Armor, and Artillery. They would land on January 22nd. They would seize the port. They would push inland. And then somehow they would trigger the collapse of the entire German position in Italy. The plan assumed speed, assumed aggression, assumed that surprise would compensate for limited numbers. It assumed, above all, that whoever commanded the landing would share Churchill's offensive spirit. That assumption, more than any other, would determine whether Anzio became the breakthrough that saved Italy or the disaster that defined it. As soldiers boarded ships at Naples, writing final letters home, none of them knew that the next 4 months would transform a quiet beach town into one of World War II's bloodiest killing grounds. January 9th, 1944. A villa in Marrakesh, Morocco, where palm trees swayed in African breezes. Winston Churchill sat recovering from pneumonia, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, sketching diagrams on napkins. His doctor had ordered rest. Instead, the Prime Minister was designing an amphibious assault. He drew the Italian coastline from memory, marking Anzio with an emphatic circle, then arrows thrusting inland toward the Alban Hills and Rome. To the staff officers gathered around his sickbed, he explained his vision with the fervor of a man who knew this might be his last chance to salvage the Italian campaign. The landing would be like a dagger thrust into Germany's back, sudden, deep, fatal. His hand trembled slightly as he added one more detail to the napkin, a question mark over the box labeled Landing Force Commander. That question would matter more than anyone in the room understood. Major General John Lucas was 54 years old, a career officer who had spent decades preparing for war without particularly wanting to fight one. When Mark Clark selected him to command 6th Corps and lead the Anzio operation, Lucas felt a knot of dread rather than pride. His diary entry from January 12th revealed the darkness gathering in his mind. This whole affair has a strong odor of Gallipoli. The comparison was devastating. Gallipoli, Churchill's World War I amphibious disaster, had cost 200,000 Allied casualties and destroyed careers. Lucas knew the Prime Minister's reputation for bold schemes that looked brilliant until they became catastrophes. He was being asked to lead 36,000 men behind enemy lines with limited naval support, insufficient landing craft, and objectives that ranged from vague to impossible, depending on who was giving the orders. The confusion started with the orders themselves. Churchill's vision demanded aggression, land at Anzio, race inland, seize the Alban Hills, cut the highways, threaten Rome. Speed was everything. Hesitation would allow Germans to react. The Alban Hills, rising 2,000 feet and dominating the coastal plain, had to be taken immediately before they became fortresses. From those heights, Allied artillery could interdict every road supplying the Gustav Line. From those heights, observers could see Rome itself. But when Clark briefed Lucas, the emphasis shifted. Establish the beachhead, secure the port, build up supplies. Then, when the situation permits, advance inland. The word permits did heavy lifting. It could mean hours or weeks. Lucas, cautious by nature and scarred by watching too many plans collapse on contact with reality, heard permission to be careful. Clark, pressured by Churchill and General Harold Alexander to produce dramatic results, assumed his corps commander would show initiative. Neither man clarified the contradiction. The rehearsal landing at Salerno on January 18th exposed more problems than it solved. Landing craft shortages forced troops to share boats. Training became abbreviated. Coordination between naval and ground forces remained improvised. Equipment broke down in saltwater. Radios failed. Soldiers who had never conducted an amphibious assault before tried to learn in a single chaotic practice run. The Navy crews were experienced, veterans of Sicily and Salerno, but even they expressed concern about the timeline. Supplies had to be stockpiled, loaded, and ready to flow ashore continuously for weeks. Any disruption of shipping would starve the beachhead. And those landing craft, the LSTs, landing ship tanks, that could drive right onto beaches and unload armor directly, they had to be back in England by February 5th for Normandy. That gave the Anzio force exactly 2 weeks to land, break out, link up with 5th Army advancing from the south, and declare victory. 2 weeks to accomplish what 4 months of frontal assault had failed to achieve. January 20th, 1944. The final briefing aboard HMS Bololo, the command ship. Maps covered every surface. Officers crowded into the wardroom, studying aerial photographs of Anzio's beaches. The town itself looked pleasant, a summer resort where Romans once vacationed, whitewashed buildings along a curved harbor, pine forests inland. Intelligence reports confirmed minimal German presence. 2 battalions, maybe 1,500 men total, mostly rear echelon troops manning coastal observation posts. The Luftwaffe rarely operated over the area. The nearest German reserves were at least a day's march away. On paper, it looked almost easy. Lucas presented the plan in his methodical way. Land before dawn, secure the port by noon, establish a defensive perimeter extending 5 to 7 miles inland, then evaluate. Evaluate. That word hung in the air like smoke. British commanders wanted aggression. American commanders wanted success. Lucas wanted his men to survive. The force composition reflected the mission's hybrid nature, part assault, part occupation, part gamble. American 3rd Infantry Division, hardened by combat in North Africa and Sicily, would land on the right at Anzio proper, British 1st Division would take the left at Nettuno, 3 miles down the coast. 3 Ranger battalions, elite light infantry trained for raids, would spearhead the assault on Anzio port itself. Commandos would secure the flanks. Armor would follow in later waves. Tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery. Paratroopers would drop inland to block German counterattacks. Except, at the last minute, that part was canceled due to aircraft shortages. Total strength. 36,000 men in the first wave, building to 70,000 within a week if shipping held. Against them, if intelligence was correct, 1,500 Germans. The ratio seemed overwhelming. What the intelligence photographs couldn't show was time. How many hours before that ratio reversed? Clark visited Lucas on January 21st, the night before the invasion. Their conversation would be dissected by historians for decades. Clark told Lucas to feel your way and avoid sticking his neck out. Or did he tell him to advance aggressively and seize opportunity? Both men later claimed different recollections. What's certain is that Clark left Lucas with contradictory impulses. Be bold, but don't be reckless. Seize objectives, but don't take unnecessary risks. Lucas watched his superior depart, then returned to his cabin to write another diary entry. I must keep my feet on the ground and my forces in hand. That sentence encapsulated his philosophy and sealed Anzio's fate. Caution felt like wisdom, but in amphibious warfare, caution often meant death. The plan called for a wildcat. Lucas commanded 36,000 men, who would land successfully but fight like they expected to lose. Across the Mediterranean, the invasion fleet assembled in darkness. 243 ships, transports, destroyers, minesweepers, rocket ships, cruisers, LSTs, LCIs, LCVPs, the alphabet soup of amphibious warfare. British and American sailors worked side by side, loading ammunition, checking engines, studying tide tables. The weather forecast looked perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, nearly full moon for navigation, then darkness for the actual landing. Naval gunfire support included cruisers with 6-inch guns capable of firing 20 miles inland. It was an armada assembled with tremendous effort, carrying men who had trained for months, supplied by a logistics chain stretching back to America. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Everything except the unknowable. What happens when you land behind enemy lines with no way to reinforce quickly if things go wrong? Soldiers crammed into the transport ships wrote letters home, cleaned weapons, tried to sleep. Many were veterans who knew what morning would bring. Others were replacements who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Chaplains moved through the crowded decks, offering communion, hearing confessions, providing whatever comfort religion could offer men heading into battle. Some soldiers joked nervously, others sat silent, lost in private thoughts. The Rangers, professionals who had trained for exactly this kind of mission, radiated confidence. The regular infantry, remembering Salerno's chaos and bloody beaches, radiated anxiety. Officers checked their watches obsessively. The plan called for ships to reach their positions by 0200 hours, January 22nd. Assault waves would land at 0230. By dawn, they should control the port and be digging in several miles inland. As midnight passed and January 22nd began, the fleet turned toward the Italian coast. Submarine alerts had been cleared. Minesweepers reported channels clean. Aerial reconnaissance detected no unusual German activity around Anzio. It was almost too quiet, which made everyone nervous. Lucas stood on Bololo's bridge, watching the dark coastline emerge from darkness. Somewhere ahead lay the beach that would either vindicate Churchill's vision or become Churchill's next Gallipoli. Lucas had done everything by the book: careful planning, thorough preparation, methodical execution. But battles aren't won by books. They're won by men willing to gamble everything on a single decisive moment. As the first landing craft lowered into the water and soldiers climbed down cargo nets into the darkness, the question hanging over Anzio wasn't whether they could land successfully. The question was whether they would fight like men who came to win or men who came to survive. That distinction, invisible in planning documents, would mean the difference between breakthrough and bloodbath. 0200 hours, January 22nd, 1944. The Italian coastline appeared as a dark smudge against darker sky. On the lead destroyer, radar operators counted distance in yards, 5,000, 4,000, 3,000. The fleet crept forward in near total silence, engines throttled to minimum, voices reduced to whispers. Men in landing craft gripped their rifles and watched the shore, expecting searchlights to suddenly blaze, expecting coastal batteries to open fire, expecting the sudden chaos of opposed landing. Instead, they heard only the slap of waves against hulls and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in Anzio. It was the silence that terrified them most. Every veteran knew that quiet meant ambush. Quiet meant Germans waiting until the boats hit the beach before opening fire. Quiet meant a killing ground. 0230 hours. First wave hits the beach. Rangers from Colonel William Darby's battalions splash through surf onto sand near Anzio Harbor, weapons raised, expecting hell. Instead, they found an empty beach. No machine guns, no mortars, no Germans at all. Disbelief spread through the assault wave like a shock wave. They had trained for opposed landing, smoke, suppression fire, casualties in the surf. They got silence. Darby himself waded ashore in the second wave, astonished to find his men spreading out in textbook formation against zero resistance. Within 30 minutes, Rangers had pushed through the town of Anzio itself, finding cafes and shops locked for the night, civilians asleep in their beds, German garrison buildings abandoned so recently that coffee still sat warm in cups. It was as if someone had evacuated the entire enemy force hours before the landing. 3 miles south at Nettuno, British 1st Division experienced the same surreal success. Landing craft grounded on beaches, ramps dropped, and infantry surged ashore ready for battle. They found sand dunes and pine forests, and absolutely no Germans. One British soldier later described it as more like a peacetime exercise than an invasion. Officers trained to expect resistance had to restrain their men from rushing inland in confusion. This wasn't how battles worked. Where were the defenders? Where was the artillery? Even undefended beaches usually had mines, wire, obstacles. Anzio had nothing. By 0330 hours, British troops had secured Nettuno and pushed 2 miles inland without firing a shot. The only casualties so far were a handful of men who had twisted ankles climbing down cargo nets in darkness. By 0800 hours, with dawn breaking over Italy, the scope of Allied success became clear. Anzio port was captured intact, cranes working, docks undamaged, warehouses full of supplies the Germans had abandoned. Both beach sectors were secure. Vehicles were rolling off LSTs directly onto Italian sand. Artillery batteries were deploying inland. The beachhead perimeter had expanded to roughly 7 miles wide and 3 miles deep. Total Allied casualties: 13 killed, 97 wounded, 44 missing, against German resistance that ranged from light to non-existent. It was one of the most successful amphibious landings in military history. Ships' crews stared at the beaches in amazement. This was supposed to be the hard part, the part where you measured success by how many men you didn't lose. Instead, it looked like they had landed on a vacation beach. The German side of the surprise was equally shocking. The nearest Wehrmacht units, 2 understrength battalions totaling about 1,500 men, had been scattered across 20 miles of coastline. They were rear echelon troops, clerks, mechanics, convalescents recovering from wounds suffered at the Gustav Line. Their mission was to observe and report, not defend against an amphibious invasion. When the first reports reached regimental headquarters, Allied ships offshore, troops landing at Anzio, junior officers assumed it was reconnaissance, maybe a raid. By the time they realized it was a full invasion, the port had already fallen. Small German detachments tried to organize delaying actions, but Rangers and British infantry simply bypassed them. Some Germans fled north toward Rome, others surrendered. A few called desperately for instructions that never came because nobody higher up the chain of command yet understood what was happening. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding all German forces in Italy, was 150 miles north near Lake Garda when fragmentary reports began arriving around 1400 hours on the 22nd. The messages were confused, contradictory, and terrifying. Large Allied fleet at Anzio, port captured, thousands of troops ashore. Kesselring's first reaction was disbelief. Intelligence had predicted any Allied amphibious operation would target the area around Gaeta, farther south, not Anzio. He had positioned reserves accordingly. Now he was caught completely out of position with the Allies behind his lines, threatening Rome, threatening his entire defensive strategy. The Gustav Line, the mountain fortress that had cost Allies so dearly, was suddenly vulnerable to encirclement. If the Anzio force drove inland to the Alban Hills and cut Highway 6, the entire German 10th Army fighting at Cassino would be trapped. This was the nightmare scenario German planning had tried to prevent. But Kesselring was a master of improvisation, and the initial panic quickly gave way to cold calculation. The Allied landing was successful, yes, but also small. 36,000 men in an initial wave could be contained if he acted fast enough. The key was time. How long before the Allies exploited their surprise? How long before they pushed inland to positions he couldn't retake? His staff began pulling up maps, calculating distances, identifying units that could be redirected to Anzio. 4th Parachute Division was training near Rome. Send them immediately. Hermann Göring Panzer Division was in reserve north of Rome. Start moving south. Elements of the 315th Infantry Division could detach from the Gustav Line. More units from Genoa, Leghorn, even southern France could be ordered to Italy. It would take days to assemble a real counterattack force, but within hours he could create a screen, enough troops to slow the Allied advance, buy time, prevent breakthrough. Everything depended on whether the Allies moved fast or consolidated. By late afternoon on January 22nd, the situation stabilized into an operational pause that would define everything that followed. Allied forces held a beachhead roughly 7 miles wide and 3 to 4 miles deep. They controlled Anzio and Nettuno completely. Patrols had pushed as far as the Mussolini Canal to the east and the Via Appia to the north. Reconnaissance elements reported roads ahead empty. No significant German presence between the beach and the Alban Hills 12 miles inland. Rome itself, the glittering prize, sat just 33 miles away. For perhaps 12 to 24 hours, Highway 7, the main route north, lay open and vulnerable. A rapid thrust by armor and motorized infantry could reach the Alban Hills before nightfall on the 23rd. From there, artillery could interdict every road feeding the Gustav Line. The opportunity existed, tangible and real. General Lucas established his headquarters in a wine cellar 3 miles inland and surveyed the situation. His staff presented options: push immediately toward Campo Leone and the Alban Hills, or consolidate the beachhead and build up supplies. Lucas remembered Salerno, where premature inland advances had nearly led to disaster when Germans counterattacked. He remembered every military principle about maintaining supply lines and not overextending. He looked at his maps, showing 36,000 men sitting behind enemy lines with more Germans arriving every hour. The safe choice, the prudent choice, the choice that saved lives was to dig in. Expand the perimeter slowly, stockpile ammunition, wait for reinforcements. The bold choice was to gamble everything on speed, to drive inland before the window closed. Lucas chose safety. He issued orders: establish defensive positions, prepare for German counterattack, advance will resume when situation permits. Those orders, perfectly reasonable by conventional military logic, surrendered the initiative. The element of surprise, bought with meticulous planning and perfect execution, evaporated into the Italian winter air like morning fog. By nightfall, January 22nd, both sides understood the new reality. The Allies had landed successfully and held a beachhead that couldn't be immediately dislodged. The Germans had been surprised but not destroyed, and were racing reinforcements toward Anzio. The window of opportunity, That narrow span of hours when surprise could be converted into strategic victory had opened wide, invited exploitation, and began slowly closing. Soldiers on the beach dug foxholes, stacked ammunition, and wondered why they weren't advancing. Officers studied maps and calculated tonnages, and in headquarters from Rome to the Gustav Line, German commanders scrambled to transform panic into plan, knowing that if they could seal the beachhead before it broke out, the Allies would be trapped. The landing had been perfect. Everything that followed would be disaster. The men who waded ashore on January 22nd had achieved their objective brilliantly. What they couldn't know as they celebrated their bloodless victory, was that success had planted the seeds of catastrophe. January 22nd, 1800 hours. General Lucas stood in his command post, a commandeered farmhouse with wine barrels lining the walls. Maps covered a rough wooden table. Red pins showed Allied positions, a satisfying arc extending inland from the beaches. Blue pins showed reported German positions, scattered, fragmentary, mostly question marks. His staff officers waited for orders. Some expected immediate exploitation. "Sir, the road to Campoleone is open. We should push reconnaissance in force." Others advocated caution. "We've got 36,000 men and one port. We need to consolidate before advancing." Lucas listened to both arguments and chose the path that felt safest. Establish defensive positions. Secure the flanks. Build up supplies for 48 hours. Then, when the beachhead was properly organized, advance methodically toward objectives. It was the decision of a competent, experienced commander applying lessons learned from previous battles. It was also the decision that would transform Anzio from breakthrough to bloodbath. The geography of opportunity showed itself most clearly on January 23rd. Patrols from 3rd Division's 7th Infantry Regiment advanced north toward the village of Campoleone and the factory area, a cluster of buildings that would later become infamous. They encountered nothing. No Germans, no roadblocks, no artillery fire. By 0900 hours, lead elements had pushed to within 2 miles of Campoleone itself, which sat at the foot of the Alban Hills. One reconnaissance platoon climbed a ridge and could actually see the hills rising ahead. The strategic objective, the high ground that controlled everything, sitting empty and vulnerable. The platoon leader radioed back. "Roads clear, no enemy contact, request permission to continue advance." The answer came down from division, from corps, from Lucas himself. Hold position, consolidate, do not advance beyond assigned phase lines. The soldiers, confused but obedient, dug in and watched the hills they could have taken. While Lucas consolidated, Kesselring improvised with desperate speed. His phone lines burned with urgent orders. 4th Parachute Division, training near Rome, received movement orders within hours of the landing. By afternoon of the 23rd, lead battalions were boarding trucks for the trip south. Hermann Göring Panzer Division began a forced march toward Anzio, armor rattling down highways at maximum speed. The 362nd Infantry Division detached elements from coastal defense near Civitavecchia. The 71st Infantry Division came from Leghorn. The 26th Panzer Division received orders to prepare for movement from 10th Army Sector on the Gustav Line. It was an organizational nightmare. Units from different sectors, different commands, with different equipment and readiness levels, all converging on a single point. Normally, assembling such a force would take weeks. Kesselring demanded it happen in days. The German reinforcement rate revealed Kesselring's genius for improvisation and the Allies' strategic mistake. In the first 48 hours after the landing, 18,000 German troops reached the Anzio area. Not organized divisions, but battle groups. Regiment-sized task forces with mixed infantry, armor, and artillery thrown together from whatever was available. They arrived piecemeal, often without complete equipment, sometimes short of ammunition. But they arrived fast, and they arrived in positions that began encircling the Allied beachhead. By January 24th, German forces formed a rough semicircle from the coast northwest of Anzio, arcing north through Campoleone, then swinging southeast toward the Mussolini Canal. The noose wasn't tight yet, but it was taking shape. Lucas's diary entry for January 24th revealed the mindset that would damn him in history. I must keep my feet on the ground and my forces in hand and do nothing foolish. Foolish. That word carried weight for a general who had seen too many bold plans collapse into bloody chaos. Foolish meant Gallipoli. Foolish meant commanders who sacrifice men for glory. Foolish meant extending your supply lines until the enemy cut them and trapped your force. Lucas believed he was being wise, professional, responsible. He believed the textbooks that said, consolidate your beachhead, build combat power, then attack from strength. What the textbooks didn't address was time, the unstoppable clock that gave Germans more hours to react, more days to reinforce, more weeks to transform Anzio from opportunity into trap. The contrast between what was and what might have been haunted Allied planners. Highway 7, the Via Appia, Rome's ancient road to the south, remained open and usable for 72 hours after the landing. A motorized column could have driven to the Alban Hills on January 23rd with minimal opposition. By January 25th, German roadblocks were in place. The hills themselves, commanding the landscape and offering observation over the entire coastal plain, sat empty until January 24th, when advance elements of the 4th Parachute Division began occupying positions. 24 hours earlier, they could have belonged to the Allies without a fight. The distance from the beach to the hills measured only 12 miles, less than a half-day's march for infantry, an hour's drive for vehicles, 12 miles. The difference between strategic victory and strategic stalemate measured 12 miles and 48 hours. Lucas had both and used neither. Churchill's reaction, when news of the consolidation reached London, was volcanic. He had envisioned a wildcat leaping ashore, claws extended, racing inland to tear at German communications. Instead, he got reports of troops digging defensive positions and stockpiling supplies. His message to Field Marshal Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, dripped with sarcasm and fury. I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale wallowing on the beaches. The metaphor was brutal but accurate. The Anzio force, designed for aggressive exploitation, had instead become defensive and static, the very quality that should have made it dangerous. Its position behind enemy lines now made it vulnerable. A beachhead is only valuable if it breaks out. Otherwise, it's just a target. The operational shift from offense to defense happened with stunning speed. By January 25th, instead of Allied forces threatening Rome, German forces were threatening the beachhead. Lucas ordered his units to prepare defensive positions in depth, organize fields of fire, register artillery on likely German approach routes. These were all correct measures for a force expecting to be attacked. They were suicidal measures for a force that should have been attacking. Every hour spent improving defensive positions was an hour Germans used to bring up more troops. Every day spent consolidating was a day the strategic opportunities slipped further away. The initiative, that intangible but crucial advantage in warfare, had transferred from Allies to Germans so smoothly that many officers didn't even notice until it was too late. By January 27th, Kesselring felt confident enough to tour the front lines personally. He drove from Rome to Campoleone, inspecting positions, talking to commanders, positioning artillery batteries on high ground with clear observation over the beachhead. What he saw satisfied him. The crisis had passed. The Allies weren't advancing. His improvised defensive ring was holding. More divisions were arriving daily. The beachhead, instead of being a dagger pointed at Rome, was becoming a pocket that could be contained, squeezed, and eventually eliminated. He reported to Hitler's headquarters that the situation was under control. The Anzio landing, initially terrifying, had been neutralized. All it had taken was the Allies' caution and Germany's speed. Kesselring had won the race not because his troops were faster, but because the Allies had stopped running. The question that would haunt historians for decades took shape in those first 72 hours. Was Lucas right or wrong? Defenders argued he saved the beachhead from premature destruction. If he had advanced aggressively on the 22nd, Germans might have cut off his force and annihilated it piecemeal. Better to consolidate, build strength, than attack methodically. Critics countered that the whole point of an amphibious end run was speed. Surprise plus aggression equals breakthrough. By choosing caution, Lucas surrendered the only advantage that justified the landing in the first place. Both arguments had merit. Both missed the deeper truth. War punishes hesitation and rewards the commander willing to gamble everything on a single decisive moment. Lucas was asked to be Patton, but commanded like Montgomery. The mission required wildcat. He delivered whale. And on the beaches of Anzio, as soldiers dug deeper foxholes and watched German positions multiply on the hills ahead, the price of that mismatch began to come due. January 22nd evening. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters, 150 miles north of Anzio. The telephone rang at 1400 hours with fragmentary reports. Allied ships, troops landing, Anzio port under attack. Kesselring's first response was disbelief. His second was calculation. His third was action. Within 30 minutes, he had grasped the essential truth. The Allies had landed behind his lines with enough force to threaten everything, but not enough force to guarantee success. The window to contain them was measured in hours, maybe days. He began issuing orders with the rapid-fire precision of a man who knew this moment would define his career. Units across Italy and southern France received movement directives. Some commanders questioned the orders, pull troops from the Gustav Line while Fifth Army was attacking, strip coastal defenses, risk leaving other sectors vulnerable. Kesselring's answer was simple. If Anzio isn't contained, none of the other sectors matter because the entire Italian front collapses. The logistical achievement of the German response deserves recognition as one of World War II's most impressive defensive improvisations. Within 12 hours of the landing, units were moving toward Anzio from 14 separate locations. Hermann Göring Panzer Division, stationed near Leghorn, 150 miles north, began loading tanks on rail cars and trucks. The division would arrive in pieces over 3 days, but lead elements reached Anzio within 48 hours. An astounding speed for heavy armor. 4th Parachute Division, an elite formation recovering from combat, scrambled from training areas around Rome. These paratroopers, veterans of Africa and Sicily, were exactly the kind of high-quality troops needed to establish a defensive perimeter quickly. By nightfall, January 23rd, advanced battalions were digging in near Campo Leone, blocking the road to Rome. The assembly of Kesselring's defensive force looked chaotic on paper, but brilliant in execution. He created battle groups, temporary task forces built around whatever units could reach Anzio fastest. Some groups were regimental strength with full artillery support. Others were battalion-sized with improvised equipment. The 362nd Infantry Division sent 2 regiments from Civitavecchia. The 71st Infantry Division contributed a regiment from Genoa. The 26th Panzer Division detached a Panzer Grenadier Regiment from the Gustav Line. Independent units, assault gun battalions, Navalwerfer rocket launcher companies, engineer companies, even Luftwaffe field divisions received orders to converge on Anzio. It was military jazz, improvisation in real time, creating a defensive orchestra from scattered musicians who had never played together before. The numbers tell the story of Germany's reaction, speed versus Allied caution. By January 24th, 48 hours after landing, German forces around Anzio numbered approximately 40,000 men. By January 28th, 1 week after landing, 71,500 Germans faced 69,000 Allied troops. The hunters had become the hunted. The force that landed behind German lines now found itself surrounded by Germans. And critically, those German forces occupied the high ground. The Alban Hills and Colli Laziali gave German artillery observers a panoramic view of the entire beachhead. Every Allied position was visible from above. Every movement drew fire. German gunners could shell the port, the beaches, the supply dumps, the hospitals. Nothing was safe because nothing was hidden. Kesselring's personal leadership style drove the successful response. While Hitler's headquarters debated strategy and Mussolini's government panicked about Rome's vulnerability, Kesselring focused on execution. He toured the front lines on January 27th, appearing suddenly at command posts to check defensive positions. Soldiers later described him as energetic, confident, asking detailed questions about fields of fire and ammunition stocks. He positioned artillery batteries personally, choosing locations that maximized observation and interlocking fire. When unit commanders complained about shortage of anti-tank weapons, he redirected supplies from other sectors. When subordinates suggested retreat might be wiser than defending so close to Allied naval guns, he overruled them. The beachhead would be contained, period. Retreat was not an option. The defensive ring Kesselring assembled utilized geography brilliantly. The beachhead sat on coastal plain, flat, open, with few natural defensive features, but surrounding it were the Alban Hills to the northeast, the Lepini Mountains to the east, and the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west. Kesselring positioned forces to create a horseshoe. 4th Parachute Division and Hermann Göring Panzer Division held the northern arc from Caroceto through Campo Leone. Infantry divisions held the eastern flank along the Mussolini Canal. Additional forces sealed the western approaches. Artillery concentrated on the hills where elevation gave range and observation. The result was a killing ground. Any Allied advance would be moving uphill into prepared positions with artillery firing from commanding heights. It was defensive warfare at its most efficient. The contrast with Allied deployments highlighted the reversal of fortune. Lucas's forces spread across the beachhead in roughly circular perimeter, attempting to defend in all directions simultaneously. German forces occupied specific strong points and observation positions, concentrating combat power at key terrain. The Allies controlled the port and flat ground. The Germans controlled everything that mattered: the hills, the observation, the ability to see and destroy. Artillery became the decisive weapon, and the side with better observation would win the artillery duel. Every German gun on the heights could fire with adjusted precision. Allied guns on the flat beachhead fired at map coordinates, hoping to hit targets they couldn't see. The mathematics of indirect fire favored defenders absolutely. By late January, Kesselring's operational assessment was cautiously optimistic. The crisis had passed. The Allies weren't advancing aggressively, which meant the defensive perimeter could be strengthened daily. More units continued to arrive. Eventually, the force around Anzio would grow to 9 divisions, a testament to Germany's ability to react, despite fighting on multiple fronts. Kesselring reported to Berlin that the beachhead was contained and could be held indefinitely. Better yet, it could be attacked. Hitler wanted the beachhead eliminated, driven into the sea, the threat erased completely. Kesselring believed that was possible if given time to assemble sufficient forces. The Allies had landed successfully, but failed to exploit. That failure gave Germany the chance to transform defense into offense. The strategic irony was profound. Operation Shingle had been designed to force Germans to abandon the Gustav Line by threatening their rear. Instead, Kesselring held both fronts simultaneously. 10th Army under General Heinrich von Vietinghoff continued fighting at Cassino, bleeding 5th Army in mountain warfare. 14th Army under General Eberhard von Mackensen formed around Anzio to contain the beachhead. Germany, supposedly on the defensive and resource poor, was fighting 2 major battles in Italy simultaneously, while also preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. The accomplishment spoke to German military professionalism, ruthless efficiency, and the power of interior lines, the ability to shift forces short distances between threatened sectors faster than an enemy attacking from external positions. The human cost of Kesselring's success appeared in the faces of German soldiers streaming toward Anzio. Paratroopers who had hoped for rest after Africa found themselves in trucks heading to a new battle. Panzer crews who thought they had weeks to refit their tanks instead drove them south on one day's notice. Infantry pulled from the Gustav Line muttered about fighting in 2 places at once. But they came. They obeyed orders, took positions, and prepared to defend or attack as commanded. German military discipline, for all its association with Nazi ideology, was also a professional culture that valued competence and rewarded initiative. Kesselring's orders made sense tactically, and soldiers trusted his leadership because he delivered results. Within 1 week, he had transformed Allied threat into German opportunity. The beachhead existed but couldn't break out. The Allies sat behind enemy lines but were surrounded, and every day Lucas consolidated instead of attacking was another day Germany used to prepare for the counteroffensive that would turn Anzio from landing site into graveyard. January 29th, night. 767 men from the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions moved through darkness towards Cisterna, a small town 8 miles from the beach. Colonel William Darby, the legendary Ranger commander, had handpicked these troops for what should have been a textbook infiltration. Slip behind German lines, seize the town, cut Highway 7, demonstrate that Allied forces could still maneuver aggressively. The Rangers moved in single file through irrigation ditches called wadis, these ancient drainage channels that crisscross the farmland like veins. They advanced silently, weapons ready, using every tactical skill they had learned. At 0300 hours, they were within a mile of Cisterna. At 0400 hours, they were in position to attack at dawn. At 0530 hours, as first light broke over Italy, they realized they had walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. The German trap closed with mechanical precision. 4th Parachute Division, occupying Cisterna, had detected the Ranger infiltration hours earlier. Instead of engaging immediately, German commanders let the Rangers advance deep into the kill zone. When dawn revealed the Americans' position, spread along exposed wadis with no cover, no concealment, and no way to retreat without crossing open ground, German machine guns opened fire from 3 sides simultaneously. The Rangers, caught in irrigation ditches that became death traps, tried to fight back. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. Mortars dropped rounds directly into the wadis. Artillery walked fire along the drainage channels. German infantry advanced methodically, compressing the Ranger positions into smaller and smaller pockets. By mid-morning, individual Ranger companies were fighting isolated last stands. The radio traffic from Cisterna told the story of annihilation in real time. We're surrounded, need immediate support. They're coming from all sides, running low on ammunition. Where's the relief column? The relief column, tanks and infantry from 3rd Division, had been promised to support the Rangers, but stalled 3 miles short of Cisterna when German anti-tank guns knocked out lead vehicles. The column commander faced the same mathematics that had paralyzed Lucas. Advance into a kill zone and lose everything, or stop and try to survive. He stopped. The Rangers, waiting for rescue that would never come, fought until their ammunition ran out. Some tried to escape through German lines. A handful succeeded, most didn't. By nightfall, January 30th, 761 of 767 Rangers were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Only 6 men made it back to Allied lines. An entire elite formation destroyed in less than 24 hours. While Rangers died at Cisterna, 3rd Division attacked the same objective from a different direction. The 7th and 15th Infantry Regiments advanced across open farmland toward the town, supported by armor and artillery. They gained 2 miles in 3 days of continuous combat and suffered 1,400 casualties doing it. Every field became a battlefield. Every farmhouse became a fortress. German defenders used the terrain brilliantly, reverse slope positions that hid them from Allied artillery, interlocking machine gun fire that covered every approach, rapid counterattacks by armor whenever Americans seized a position. The 3rd Division, veteran troops who had fought through Sicily and Salerno, had never experienced defensive fire this intense. German Mark IV tanks appeared seemingly from nowhere, fired at point-blank range, then withdrew before American tank destroyers could respond. The advance measured in yards per day, and each yard cost blood. British forces attacking toward Campoleone and the factory experienced identical slaughter. 1st Division launched its offensive on January 30th, advancing up the Via Anziati toward the base of the Alban Hills. Initial success came quickly, 3 miles gained, the factory complex and village of Carosito captured by evening of the 1st. Then German counterattacks began. Hermann Göring Panzer Division, newly arrived at the front, struck British positions with combined arms assaults that demonstrated German tactical sophistication. Infantry advanced behind artillery barrages while tanks provided mobile firepower. British troops, fighting from hastily prepared positions, held initially, but began cracking under sustained pressure. By February 2nd, British casualties exceeded 2,000 men. The factory changed hands 3 times. Carosito became rubble, and the Alban Hills remained in German hands, observation posts directing artillery fire that made every Allied position untenable. The tactical lessons were brutal and clear. The window for easy advance had closed completely. Every German position was now prepared, sighted for mutual support, and defended by troops who knew their business. The terrain, flat farmland with minimal cover, favored defenders absolutely. Wadis that Rangers had hoped would provide concealment became killing channels where German machine guns could fire the length of the ditch. Stone farmhouses, ubiquitous across the Italian countryside, became miniature fortresses that require tank support to reduce. And German artillery, positioned on high ground with perfect observation, could drop fire on any Allied movement within minutes. Attack had become synonymous with casualty. Advance had become synonymous with death. The human dimension of this combat appeared in field hospitals overwhelmed by the wounded. Surgeons operated in shifts 24 hours per day, in converted wine cellars and farmhouse basements. The types of wounds reflected the nature of combat. Shrapnel from artillery and mortars dominated, followed by machine gun fire, then mines. Medical staff, trained to handle battlefield trauma, struggled with the sheer volume. Ambulances made constant runs from front lines to beach hospitals, then hospital ships offshore. The ratio of killed to wounded, normally about 1 to 3, began shifting toward 1 to 2 as artillery became the primary killer. High explosive shells didn't wound. They killed or they maimed catastrophically. Surgeons learned to amputate quickly to save lives, creating a generation of veterans who would return home missing limbs. Psychiatric casualties, combat fatigue, shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress, appeared in numbers that shocked medical personnel. Soldiers who had functioned normally in Sicily or Salerno broke under the sustained artillery bombardment and constant death at Anzio. Some sat catatonic in foxholes, unable to speak or move. Others walked to rear areas in dazed states, claiming they needed to deliver messages, then couldn't remember what the message was. A few became violent, attacking their own officers or making suicidal charges against German positions. The medical term was exhaustion, but the reality was psychological destruction. Men can endure only so much random death before their minds protect them through shutdown. Anzio, with its constant artillery and inescapable danger, broke men faster than previous battles. The operational reality by early February was undeniable. Anzio had shifted from offensive to defensive, from breakthrough to survival. Units that had landed expecting to race toward Rome now dug deeper foxholes and prayed to survive the day. Officers who had planned exploitation now planned for German counterattacks. The beachhead perimeter, instead of expanding, began contracting as German pressure intensified. Lucas's headquarters issued new orders reflecting the changed circumstances. Hold present positions, prepare for enemy offensive, evacuate non-essential personnel. That last order revealed how desperate the situation had become. This was a beachhead behind enemy lines that was now evacuating people because it couldn't guarantee their safety. The strategic questions raised by the failed offenses were profound and divisive. Should Lucas have attacked on January 22nd when roads were open? Would aggressive advance have succeeded or led to earlier disaster? Was the Ranger operation at Cisterna a calculated risk or criminal negligence? Could British forces have taken the Alban Hills if reinforced instead of 3rd Division attacking Cisterna? The debates raged in headquarters, in after-action reports, in communications back to London and Washington. But for soldiers in the foxholes, the questions were simpler and more immediate. How long can we hold? When will relief come? And the darkest question of all, will any of us leave this beach alive? The landing had been brilliant. The consolidation had been prudent. The attacks had been brave. None of it mattered because Anzio had become a trap and the jaws were closing. February 10th, 1944. A soldier from the 45th Division wrote a letter home describing his new residence, a cave carved into volcanic tufa cliffs near Anzio port. The entrance was 4 feet high, requiring him to crawl. Inside, 6 men shared a space roughly 10 feet by 8 feet. No light except candles, no heat except body warmth. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling. Rats the size of cats competed for food scraps. The smell of unwashed bodies, moldy earth, and fear created an atmosphere he couldn't adequately describe. But the cave was 7 feet underground, which meant it could probably withstand anything except a direct hit from heavy artillery. 7 feet of earth between him and death. He slept there, ate there, tried to maintain sanity there. Coming outside, even for minutes, meant risking death. So he lived like an animal in a hole and tried to remember what sunshine felt like. The physical geography of Anzio had transformed from beach resort to underground city. Tens of thousands of troops lived in caves, dugouts, and cellars, emerging only when necessary. The volcanic tufa stone, soft enough to excavate with picks and shovels, allowed soldiers to create elaborate tunnel systems. Some dugouts reached depths of 8 to 10 feet, enough to protect against everything except the heaviest German shells. Engineers improved natural caves, shoring them with timber, installing drainage, even running communications wire for field telephones. The beachhead became a subterranean world where daylight was dangerous and darkness was safety. Soldiers developed a peculiar vampire existence, sleeping during German artillery's predictable daytime schedule, emerging at night to move supplies and rotate positions. The Anzio Express became the most hated and most predictable event in the daily routine. German railway guns, including the massive 280mm K5, could fire from positions 20 miles away, well beyond Allied counter-battery range. These monsters lobbed shells weighing 560 pounds each into the beachhead. The sound of their approach, a freight train rumble growing louder, gave soldiers perhaps 10 seconds to find cover. Impact created craters 20 feet across and 10 feet deep. The Germans fired the railway guns on schedule, like sadistic clockwork. 1,700 hours most days, the express arrived. Soldiers learned to check their watches and head underground before the appointed time. Some days, the Germans varied the schedule just to catch men in the open. Psychological warfare mixed with high explosives. Highway 7, the ancient Via Appia, crossed the beachhead via an overpass that became notorious as Hell's Half Acre, or the Bowling Alley. The overpass stood exposed to German observation from the Alban Hills. Crossing it meant being visible to enemy artillery spotters who could call down fire within seconds. Supply trucks had to use the road. There was no alternative route. Drivers developed techniques to survive, approach at maximum speed, accelerate through the exposed section. Prey shells didn't land during the 30-second crossing window. Some made it, many didn't. Wrecked vehicles lined both sides of the road, testimony to German marksmanship. Soldiers ordered to cross on foot ran in small groups, spacing themselves to avoid multiple casualties from a single shell. The overpass became a symbol of Anzio's inescapable danger. Even routine movement could be fatal. The daily artillery bombardment averaged 500 to 1,000 shells. On bad days, the count reached thousands. February 29th would set the record. 10,000 shells in 24 hours. German gunners had pre-registered every important target: the port, supply dumps, road junctions, suspected headquarters locations. They fired harassment and interdiction missions around the clock, not trying to destroy specific targets, but to make life unbearable and movement impossible. The psychological effect exceeded the physical. Soldiers learned to recognize different sounds: the whistle of 105mm shells, the deeper rumble of 150mm, the screaming terror of Nebelwerfer rockets. Each sound triggered instant fear response: drop, curl, pray. Men developed elaborate superstitions about which foxholes were lucky, which sectors were safer, which times of day drew less fire. Medical personnel struggled with a casualty profile unlike anything they had trained for. Physical wounds remained constant: shrapnel, gunshots, blast injuries. But psychological casualties reached unprecedented levels. By mid-February, combat fatigue cases accounted for 30% of total casualties in some units, surpassing any previous battle in American military history. Young men who had functioned normally a month ago sat vacant-eyed in aid stations, unable to speak, unable to process reality. The term thousand-yard stare entered the vocabulary, that hollow, distant look of someone whose mind had retreated from horror too great to comprehend. Psychiatrists, few in number and overwhelmed by demand, tried to categorize and treat. Most patients received rest and were returned to duty. Some never recovered. The humanitarian disaster extended to civilians trapped in the beachhead. Anzio and Nettuno's populations, roughly 30,000 combined, had nowhere to evacuate. Those who fled inland encountered German forces. Those who stayed endured the same artillery that targeted soldiers. Families lived in cellars alongside troops, sharing limited food and water. Children grew up knowing nothing but bombardment. To them, constant explosions were normal. Aid workers tried to maintain some separation between military and civilian areas, but in a beachhead 7 miles wide, separation was impossible. German artillery didn't distinguish. Shells fell on hospitals marked with red crosses, on churches, on residential blocks. The rules of war, such as they were, didn't apply when the battlefield was also a city. The supply situation created its own desperate mathematics. Everything the beachhead needed: ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment, came through Anzio port or across the beaches. German artillery targeted both continuously. Ships unloaded at night under blackout conditions, crane operators working blind, stevedores racing to move cargo before dawn brought renewed shelling. LSTs beached themselves, dropped ramps, and offloaded vehicles directly onto sand while German observers called down fire. The Red Cross hospital ship Leinster, clearly marked and supposedly immune from attack, was shelled on February 14th. The message was clear: nothing was safe, nothing was sacred. Supply officers calculated that 1,200 tons per day were needed to sustain 90,000 troops. Some days they achieved it. Other days, German artillery prevented unloading entirely, and rations were cut. Life in the beachhead developed its own macabre routine. Morning: assess who survived the night, repair damaged positions, evacuate casualties. Afternoon: endure artillery, stay underground, pray. Evening: prepare for potential German attack, rotate guards, try to eat. Night: move supplies, improve positions, grab sleep in shifts. Repeat. Days blurred into weeks. Men lost track of dates, lost weight, lost hope. The question stopped being, when will we break out, and became, how long can we hold? Soldiers wrote letters describing Anzio as hell on earth, but censors cut those passages. Families back home received cheerful lies about progress and morale. The truth, that the beachhead had become a death trap where men lived like rats and died like statistics, remained classified. By late February, Anzio had developed its own dark culture, its own gallows humor, its own way of processing the unprocessable. Soldiers joked that Anzio was the only place where you could be killed in your sleep by an enemy you never saw firing from positions you couldn't attack. They invented bitter nicknames: Anzio Racecourse for the exposed roads, Purple Heart Beach for the landing areas still under fire, Dead End Street for any road running toward German lines. They shared survival tips: never use the same foxhole 2 nights running, Never gather in groups larger than 2. Never assume anywhere is safe. And they counted days, not toward victory, but toward the simple goal of living through one more sunrise. The landing had promised glory. February delivered only grinding, inescapable horror. And somewhere in the hills above, Germans prepared the offensive that would either drive the Allies into the sea or break against their desperate defense like waves against a cliff. The answer would come soon, measured in shells and corpses. February 4th, 1944. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The Führer studied maps of Italy with mounting fury. Anzio, that name had become an obsession, a festering wound in his strategic consciousness. How dare the Allies land behind German lines and sit there, threatening Rome, mocking Wehrmacht defensive prowess? The reports from Kesselring described containment, stabilization, successful defense. Hitler demanded more. Containment wasn't enough. The beachhead must be eliminated, driven back into the sea, annihilated so thoroughly that the Allies would never attempt such an operation again. His order went out that day, transmitted through military channels with the weight of direct Führer command. The landing at Anzio must be eliminated. It is a pustule that must be lanced. Kesselring, reading the directive, understood what it meant. Containment had succeeded. Now, Hitler wanted blood. The operational planning for what would become Operation Fischfang, fish catch, began immediately. General Eberhard von Mackensen, commanding 14th Army around the beachhead, received the mission. Assemble overwhelming force, break through Allied defenses, drive to the sea, destroy the pocket. Hitler's headquarters provided reinforcements, divisions pulled from other theaters, assault gun battalions, additional artillery. The target date was February 16th, giving planners less than 2 weeks to coordinate an offensive involving over 125,000 men. The axis of attack would be straight down the Via Anziate toward Anzio port, 13 miles from German jump-off positions to the beaches. Drive a wedge through the Allied center, split the defenders, then roll up the flanks. Simple, brutal, decisive. The force Mackensen assembled represented Germany's ability to concentrate power even while fighting on multiple fronts. 3 elite divisions formed the spearhead: 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, 26th Panzer Division, and 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, units with combat experience from Russia and Africa. Infantry divisions would support on the flanks: 65th Infantry Division, 715th Infantry Division, and elements of others. Artillery preparation would involve 450 guns, from 75mm pieces to massive 170mm guns capable of firing 30-mile ranges. Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, 6-barreled monsters that screamed like banshees and devastated morale, would saturate Allied positions. The plan projected breakthrough in 48 hours, exploitation to the sea within 96 hours, total destruction of the beachhead within 1 week. The Luftwaffe, largely absent from Italian skies due to commitments defending Germany itself, scraped together 300 aircraft for the offensive. Fighter bombers would strike Allied artillery positions and command posts. Stuka dive bombers, obsolete but still terrifying, would provide close air support. The concentration represented the largest Luftwaffe operation in Italy since Salerno, testimony to Hitler's insistence that Anzio receive priority. German pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front, understood this would be dangerous. Allied anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, and any German plane operating in daylight risked encountering American P-38 fighters or British Spitfires. But orders were orders. The Luftwaffe would fly, and men would die trying. Hitler's personal involvement elevated Anzio from tactical battle to strategic obsession. He attended planning briefings, questioned details, demanded assurances of success. His generals, accustomed to the Führer's interference, walked a careful line between confidence and realism. Yes, the force was adequate. Yes, the plan was sound. But Allied artillery and naval gunfire posed serious threats. The beachhead, while surrounded, was also intensely fortified. Breaking through would cause casualties, possibly heavy casualties. Hitler dismissed such concerns. He wanted results, not excuses. The directive was explicit. If the beachhead is not eliminated, it becomes a springboard for Allied advance toward Rome and beyond. Germany couldn't afford that threat. Therefore, the beachhead must cease to exist. The German soldiers preparing for Fischfang ranged from eager to resigned. Elite Panzer Grenadiers, confident in their training and equipment, looked forward to offensive action after weeks of defensive fighting. They had held the Allies in the beachhead. Now they would destroy them. Infantry troops, many of them replacements or older reservists, felt less enthusiasm. They had seen what Allied artillery could do. They knew naval gunfire could drop shells the size of automobiles from ships offshore. And they understood that attacking across flat, open ground against prepared defenses meant casualties. Still, German military discipline held. Units assembled, rehearsed assault tactics, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared to execute orders regardless of personal feelings. The rehearsal phase revealed both German strengths and vulnerabilities. Infantry practiced movement techniques, advancing by rushes, using terrain for cover, coordinating with armor. Tank crews ran through combined arms drills, learning to support infantry without exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. Artillery officers registered fires, calculating trajectories and ammunition requirements. But the logistics of assembling such a force in secrecy proved nearly impossible. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographed German positions daily. Photo interpreters at Anzio headquarters noticed increasing activity. New artillery emplacements, troop concentrations, supply dumps. By February 12th, Allied intelligence had identified the German buildup and predicted an offensive was coming. They didn't know exactly when or where, but they knew something big was approaching. Kesselring's own assessment of Fischfang was more measured than Hitler's expectations. He believed the offensive could succeed, but recognized the risks. Allied forces, while contained, were also concentrated. Every man in the beachhead was within range of naval guns. Those guns, 8-inch rifles on cruisers, 5-inch guns on destroyers, could fire hundreds of rounds per hour with devastating accuracy. Spotter planes directed naval fire onto any target, and ships could maneuver to fire from different positions, making counter-battery fire difficult. Kesselring calculated that surprise and mass might overcome these advantages, but only if the attack achieved rapid breakthrough. A prolonged battle of attrition favored the Allies because their artillery was essentially unlimited. Ships carried thousands of shells, and more arrived daily. The countdown to February 16th proceeded with mechanical inevitability. German infantry moved into assault positions under cover of darkness. Artillery batteries completed final preparations. Ammunition stacked beside guns. Tank crews performed last-minute maintenance, knowing their vehicles' reliability could mean life or death. Officers briefed their men, the objective, the route, the timeline. Some units received schnapps rations to steady nerves. Chaplains heard confessions and offered blessings. And in foxholes across the assault sector, German soldiers checked their weapons one more time and waited for 0 hour. They were about to attack the largest concentration of Allied firepower in Italy, and many of them knew they wouldn't survive. But they were Wehrmacht, and Wehrmacht attacked when ordered. Across no man's land, Allied troops watched German preparations with growing anxiety. Lucas's headquarters issued warnings. Major attack expected, prepare for heavy assault, hold present positions at all costs. Artillery units stockpiled ammunition. Infantry improved defensive positions, laying more mines, adding more barbed wire, registering machine guns for final protective fires. Tank battalions positioned armor in reserve, ready to counterattack any breakthrough. And offshore, Allied warships took station, guns trained inland, fire control parties ashore, with radios ready to call down naval artillery. The beachhead, which had barely survived January's fighting, now had to survive what Hitler promised would be its destruction. February 16th would determine whether Anzio became Breakout or Graveyard, whether the landing succeeded or failed, whether 36,000 men who landed on January 22nd would ever leave the beach alive. The Germans were coming with overwhelming force. The question was whether overwhelming would be enough. February 16th, 0630 hours. The world ended in fire and noise. 450 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously on a 5-mile front, concentrating on the factory sector and British positions along the Via Anziate. The bombardment sounded like continuous thunder, earth erupting in geysers of black soil and shrapnel. Soldiers in forward foxholes covered their ears and pressed themselves into the bottom of their holes as the ground bucked and heaved. High explosive shells demolished buildings, shredded trees, and buried men alive when positions collapsed. Nebelwerfer rockets added their screaming terror, 6 projectiles launching simultaneously with a sound that froze blood, followed by 6 explosions that created instant death zones. The preparatory barrage lasted 90 minutes, the longest sustained bombardment Anzio had yet experienced. When it finally stopped, the sudden silence felt almost as terrifying as the noise. 0930 hours. German infantry emerged from assault trenches and advanced toward British lines. They came in waves, 3 divisions worth of infantry and armor, moving forward with clockwork precision. The first wave hit British positions near the factory, that cluster of buildings that had changed its hands multiple times already. British troops, stunned by the bombardment but not destroyed, opened fire from rubble and foxholes. Machine guns cut down the first German ranks. Artillery, pre-registered on likely approach routes, dropped shells among advancing infantry, but the Germans kept coming. Second wave, third wave, fourth wave, each stepping over the bodies of the wave before. By mid-morning, German infantry had penetrated British defenses near Corazzato, pushing 1.5 miles into the beachhead. The breakthrough was happening. British forces, particularly 1st Division's units holding the northern sector, fought with desperate courage against impossible odds. The Loyal Regiment, defending Corazzato village, held until surrounded on 3 sides, then fought in house-to-house combat until ordered to withdraw. The Gordon Highlanders, positioned in forward positions near the factory, inflicted terrible casualties on German attackers, but eventually ran low on ammunition and had to fall back. Individual companies found themselves cut off, fighting in small pockets while German forces flowed around them. Radios crackled with calls for help, requests for artillery support, desperate messages that ended mid-transmission. By afternoon of the 16th, British defensive positions had been pushed back nearly 2 miles. The Germans had achieved breakthrough, and reserves were flooding through the gap. February 17th dawned with German forces consolidating their penetration and preparing to exploit. The Spearhead, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, and 26th Panzer Division had driven a wedge roughly 2 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep into Allied lines. Tanks and infantry were within 4 miles of the beach, within sight of the sea on a clear day. Mackinson's headquarters issued exploitation orders: expand the breakthrough laterally, widen the penetration, then drive south toward Anzio port. Hitler's staff, receiving updates from the front, celebrated preliminary success. But at the tactical level, German commanders noticed troubling signs. Allied artillery fire, instead of diminishing, was intensifying. Naval gunfire was joining the battle, and American reserves, armor and infantry from 45th Division, were moving into blocking positions. The 45th Division's 157th Regiment became the dam holding back the German flood. These soldiers, many of them National Guardsmen from Oklahoma and New Mexico, occupied positions directly in the path of German exploitation. On February 17th and 18th, they fought encircled on 3 sides, supplied by airdrops, supported by artillery firing over their heads at point-blank range. German attacks hit them from north, west, and east simultaneously. Tank battles erupted at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. Infantry fought in wadis and farmhouses, losing and retaking positions hour by hour. the regimental commander radioed that his unit was hanging on by fingernails, but hanging on they were. Every hour the 157th held was an hour Allied commanders used to rush more reserves into the threatened sector. February 18th marked the crisis point. German spearheads reached Padiglione Woods, just 3 miles from the beach. From forward positions, German observers could see the Mediterranean. Ships offshore appeared as gray shapes against blue water. This was the moment. One more push, one more attack, and the breakthrough would reach the sea, splitting the beachhead into 2 isolated pockets that could be destroyed separately. Mackensen ordered maximum effort for February 19th. Every available unit would attack. But the Allies had reached the same conclusion. This was the moment of maximum danger. Lucas committed his last reserves. British Guards units, American armor, even clerks and cooks formed into emergency defense battalions. The order went out. Hold at all costs. Retreat is not authorized. The beachhead survives or dies in the next 24 hours. The Allied artillery response on February 18th and 19th exceeded anything previously experienced in Italy. Every gun in the beachhead fired at maximum rate. Fire direction centers calculated that some batteries fired over 1,000 rounds per gun in 24 hours, rates that caused barrels to glow red hot and required water cooling between fire missions. Artillery crews worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then were replaced by crews from other units. Ammunition expenditure reached 66,000 rounds in 5 days. Shells stacked so densely in impact zones that the ground looked like lunar landscape. Naval gunfire added thousands more rounds. Cruisers Brooklyn and Philadelphia positioned offshore and fired 8-inch shells at German assembly areas, communications trenches, anything that moved. The weight of metal falling on German positions defied comprehension. February 19th brought the German high watermark and simultaneous failure. Multiple attacks launched at dawn toward Allied positions near the factory and Padiglione Woods. Some penetrated another 500 yards, bringing German infantry to within 2.5 miles of the beach. But penetration wasn't breakthrough. Allied defensive lines bent, but didn't break. Counterattacks by British Guards and American armor stopped German exploitation. By afternoon, Mackensen recognized the offensive had stalled. His units were exhausted. Casualties were mounting, and continued attacks would only increase losses without achieving objectives. February 20th saw limited German attacks, more to maintain pressure than achieve breakthrough. Hitler's headquarters demanded renewed assault. Mackensen, facing military reality, began planning to consolidate gains rather than continue the bloodbath. The human cost appeared in field hospitals overwhelmed with wounded from both sides. Allied medical personnel worked on German casualties alongside their own. The Geneva Convention demanded it, and medical staff honored that obligation, even while their own comrades died for lack of beds and blood plasma. The types of wounds reflected the industrial nature of the battle. Artillery caused 70% of casualties. Massive trauma from high explosive shells, shrapnel wounds across multiple body areas, blast injuries to internal organs. Surgeons learned to assess quickly, savable or not savable. Those deemed savable got immediate treatment. Those who would die regardless received morphine and comfort. The triage decisions haunted medical officers for the rest of their lives, but in the chaos of 5 days in hell, there was no alternative. By February 20th evening, both sides assessed results and recognized a stalemate bloodier than anything Anzio had yet produced. German forces had penetrated up to 2 miles in places, but failed to reach the sea or split the beachhead. Allied forces had bent to the breaking point, but held. Casualties. German approximately 5,500. Allied approximately 3,500 in 5 days of combat. Mackensen reported to Berlin that further attacks would be counterproductive without substantial reinforcements. Lucas reported to Clark that the beachhead held but barely. Another offensive of similar intensity might succeed where this one failed. Both commanders understood the deeper truth. Anzio had become Verdun, a battle of attrition where both sides bled and neither could win decisively. The The Germans had tried to drive the Allies into the sea and failed. The Allies had tried to break out and failed. What remained was survival, endurance, and the grim mathematics of who could sustain casualties longer. February 21st, dawn. The battlefield. After Fischfang resembled landscapes from the First World War, shell craters overlapping, barbed wire tangled with bodies, burned-out tanks frozen in death poses. Burial details moved across no man's land under informal truces, collecting dead from both sides. The frozen ground made digging graves difficult, so bodies were often stacked in shell craters and covered with earth, the locations marked with crude crosses or helmets on rifles. One American soldier described walking across the factory sector and seeing bodies in every irrigation ditch, German and American and British, all mixed together, frozen in the positions they died. The smell, mercifully suppressed by winter cold, would return with spring warmth. For now, the dead simply accumulated. February 22nd brought a different kind of death. Career execution. General Mark Clark arrived at Lucas's headquarters with terse orders. You're relieved. Major General Lucian Truscott, previously commanding 3rd Division, would take over 6th Corps immediately. The official explanation cited need for aggressive leadership. The unofficial truth was that Lucas had become a scapegoat for an operation compromised from conception. He had landed successfully, consolidated prudently, defended effectively. None of it mattered because the beachhead hadn't broken out, and someone had to be blamed. Lucas took the relief with quiet dignity, packing his belongings and departing without public complaint. His diary entry for that day was brief. I thought I was winning something of a victory. History would debate whether he was right. Truscott's first orders as 6th Corps commander revealed his assessment of reality. No major offensives. Shift to defensive posture, fortify positions in depth. Prepare for renewed German attacks, but don't provoke them by attacking first. Anzio, in Truscott's strategic vision, would be a holding action, tie down German divisions, survive until the Gustav Line broke at Cassino, then coordinate Breakout with broader offensive. It was the strategy of exhausted pragmatism, accepting that the beachhead had failed its original purpose, but could still serve useful function by fixing German forces in place. The men who fought and died for those 6 miles of Italian beach might question what purpose their sacrifice served. Truscott couldn't answer that question, so he focused on ensuring fewer men died unnecessarily. Hospital ships departing Anzio in late February carried the visible cost of survival. SS St. David, a converted liner marked with red crosses, loaded 1,200 wounded for the voyage to Naples. The ship's medical staff, overwhelmed by the numbers, triaged patients into categories: ambulatory wounded who could care for themselves, litter patients requiring constant attention, critical cases requiring surgery, and dying patients receiving morphine and comfort. The dying were segregated in a separate compartment where chaplains administered last rites and held hands. Some men survived the battle only to die during the voyage, infections or blood loss finally overwhelming them. Bodies were buried at sea with simple ceremonies, weighted and slipped over the side, while officers read prayers and crews saluted. The psychiatric casualties from February's fighting arrived in numbers that shocked medical personnel. Combat fatigue, that clinical term for psychological breakdown, reached epidemic levels. 40% of casualties in some battalions during Fischfang were psychiatric rather than physical. Men who had functioned normally on February 15th sat catatonic on February 21st. Some recovered with rest and returned to duty. Others never recovered, their minds permanently shattered by 5 days of continuous bombardment and death. The Army established special facilities to handle psychiatric cases, staffed by the handful of psychiatrists available. Treatment protocols were primitive: rest, sedation, separation from combat. Some patients responded. Others required evacuation to hospitals back in the United States, classified as permanently disabled despite having no visible wounds. German commanders conducted their own assessment of Fischfang's failure, Mackinson's after-action report to Hitler's headquarters was blunt. The offensive achieved tactical penetration, but not strategic breakthrough. Allied artillery and naval gunfire proved decisive in stopping exploitation. German casualties, while sustainable, were significant. Approximately 5,500 killed and wounded for no permanent gain. The beachhead remained intact. Allied morale appeared unbroken, and the Allies still threatened Rome. Mackinson recommended shifting to containment strategy rather than attempting further annihilation offensives. Hitler, reading the report, was furious. He had demanded the beachhead be eliminated. Instead, it persisted. But even Hitler couldn't argue with arithmetic. Germany couldn't afford to lose 5,000 men every time it attacked Anzio. The strategic reassessment on both sides produced parallel conclusions. Germans would contain the beachhead, but not attempt to destroy it. Allies would hold the beachhead, but not attempt major breakouts. Both would maintain sufficient forces to defend their positions while waiting for broader developments. For Germany, this meant keeping approximately 135,000 troops around Anzio, 9 divisions that couldn't be used at Cassino, or sent to France to prepare for the inevitable Allied invasion. For the Allies, it meant maintaining 90,000 troops in a beachhead that absorbed enormous logistics for minimal strategic gain. Both sides were locked in mutual siege, bleeding resources and men for positions neither could afford to abandon, but neither could profitably exploit. Churchill's private assessment of Anzio, shared with his war cabinet in late February, revealed his bitter disappointment. "We intended to land a wildcat that would tear the bowels out of the Boche. Instead, we have a whale wallowing on the beaches." The metaphor, harsh but accurate, captured the operation's transformation from bold stroke to static defense. Churchill still believed the concept was sound. Land behind German lines, force them to react, create opportunities. But the execution had failed at critical points. Lucas's caution in the first days, insufficient forces for the mission, unrealistic expectations about what a beachhead could achieve. The Prime Minister, who had pushed for Anzio despite doubts from military advisors, now had to defend a costly operation that achieved little except tying down troops. The broader Italian campaign context showed Anzio's painful futility. While 6th Corps bled at the beachhead, 5th Army continued battering itself against the Gustav Line at Cassino. 3 major offensives, January, February, March 1944, all failed to break through. The monastery at Monte Cassino, bombed to rubble in March, was defended just as effectively by German paratroopers fighting in the ruins. The strategic logic that linked Anzio to Cassino, one would support the other, creating synergistic pressure, collapsed into mutual failure. Neither front could break through, neither could support the other. Instead, both consumed Allied resources in grinding attrition that advanced nothing except casualty lists. By late February, total Anzio casualties reached 19,000 Allied, 15,000 German. These numbers, stark and terrible, represented not just statistics, but destroyed lives. 19,000 Allied casualties meant 19,000 families receiving telegrams that began, "We regret to inform you." It meant 19,000 men who would never fully recover, physically or psychologically. It meant widows and orphans and parents burying children. The German casualties were equally tragic. 15,000 young men who died defending a dictatorship's attempt to conquer Europe, fighting for a cause that would ultimately lose, sacrificing themselves for leaders who cared nothing for their lives beyond their utility as rifle carriers. War's essential mathematics, life exchange for strategic position, played out at Anzio with particular cruelty because the strategic position gained was so minimal. The question haunting everyone involved was simple but unanswerable. Was this worth it? Tactically, the landing succeeded brilliantly. Operationally, the consolidation prevented disaster but sacrificed opportunity. Strategically, the beachhead tied down German divisions but cost Allied resources needed elsewhere. 19,000 casualties bought 6 miles of Italian beach, German defensive attention, and uncertain future possibilities. Was that a good trade? Soldiers dying in foxholes couldn't answer. Generals defending decisions couldn't answer honestly. And historians, with decades of hindsight, still debate the question with no consensus. What's certain is that Anzio survived February. What's uncertain is whether survival constituted success or merely postponed failure. The answer would come in the months ahead, as the beachhead transformed from battlefield to endurance test, and soldiers learned that sometimes the hardest victories are simply staying alive. March 5th, 1944. 20 feet underground, engineers from the 5th Army's engineering battalions completed construction of a command bunker that would have impressed medieval siege masters. The excavation measured 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, 10 feet high, carved entirely from volcanic tufa, with hand tools and explosives. Timber supports braced the ceiling. Multiple exits provided escape routes if one became blocked. Communications wire connected to surface antennas. Ventilation shafts prevented carbon dioxide buildup. Electric lights, powered by generators, illuminated the workspace. Maps covered every wall. This underground fortress, replicated in smaller versions across the beachhead, represented adaptation to a new reality. Anzio was no longer a battle of maneuver, but a siege, and sieges were won by engineering as much as courage. The underground transformation of Anzio created a subterranean city unlike anything in modern warfare. 15 miles of tunnels eventually connected command posts, aid stations, ammunition dumps, and living quarters. Main tunnels were tall enough for men to walk upright. Secondary tunnels required crawling. Some dugouts housed entire platoons, 30 men sleeping in shifts in a space barely 15 feet square. Engineers installed drainage systems to handle groundwater and rain. Chemical latrines, primitive but functional, prevented disease outbreaks that had plagued armies in previous wars. The beachhead became two worlds: the surface, dominated by German observation and artillery, where movement meant death, and the underground, relatively safe but claustrophobic, where men lived like miners emerging only for shifts of combat duty. Supply logistics evolved into complex ballet of risk and timing. Everything needed in the beachhead, 1,200 tons per day minimum, came through Anzio port or across the beaches. German artillery targeted both continuously, making daylight unloading suicidal. The solution was night operations. Ships approached under blackout conditions, guided by radio beacons. Unloading began at dusk and continued until dawn. Stevedores and troops worked in darkness, moving cargo by feel and memory. Mistakes meant delays, and delays meant ships caught in harbor at daylight became targets. LSTs developed a technique of beaching at dusk, unloading through the night, and retracting at dawn to sail away before German observers could call in fire. The system worked but was inefficient. Weather delays, equipment failures, or German harassment reduced effective unloading capacity below requirements. German observation from the Alban Hills gave the enemy an advantage Allied engineers worked desperately to counter. Every movement in the beachhead was potentially visible to German spotters using high-powered optics. Solutions included camouflage nets to hide vehicle parks, dummy positions to draw fire away from real installations, and strict movement discipline. No large formations, no unnecessary vehicular traffic, all critical movement at night. But German observers were professionals who learned to identify patterns. Supply convoys heading to specific sectors at specific times revealed troop dispositions. Increased activity in a sector often preceded an attack. The cat-and-mouse game of observation and deception became as important as actual combat. Allied counter-battery tactics evolved from crude to sophisticated across March and April. Initially, Allied artillery fired at suspected German gun positions with minimal effect. The Germans simply moved their guns after firing. Then photo reconnaissance aircraft began mapping every German position, updated daily. Flash spotting teams used triangulation to locate enemy guns by muzzle flash. Radar units, still primitive but improving, detected shell trajectories and calculated firing positions. This data funneled to fire direction centers that coordinated counter-battery missions. When German artillery fired, Allied guns would respond within minutes, saturating the firing position with shells. The system didn't eliminate German artillery, but made it costly to fire, forcing Germans to shoot and scoot tactics that reduced accuracy and volume. The defensive infrastructure grew sophisticated enough to impress German professionals. At mines, 50,000 laid by April, created belts covering likely attack routes. Barbed wire, 250 miles of it, formed obstacles that required engineers with wire cutters to breach under fire. Interlocking bunker systems created mutual support. Each position could fire on approaches to adjacent positions. Machine guns were registered to fire on final protective lines, pre-planned fires that would cut down attacking infantry at pre-designated ranges. Anti-tank ditches, too wide for vehicles to cross without bridging, channeled armor into kill zones. Dragon's teeth, pyramidal concrete obstacles, blocked tank approaches. The beachhead had become fortress. Every defensive technique from Vauban to Verdun applied to 6 miles of Italian coastline. Disease threatened the beachhead as much as German artillery. The Pontine marshes, drained by Mussolini in the 1930s, began reflooding as drainage systems collapsed under bombardment. Standing water meant mosquitoes. Mosquitoes meant malaria. By April, malaria cases were appearing in battalions that had been in the beachhead longest. Medical officers distributed quinine and later atabrine, an anti-malarial that turned skin yellow and tasted so bitter soldiers sometimes refused it. Dysentery, spread by poor sanitation and contaminated water, hospitalized hundreds. Trench foot, the same scourge that plagued World War I trenches, affected soldiers who spent too long in wet foxholes. Medical staff fought a constant battle to maintain hygiene standards under conditions that made hygiene nearly impossible. The daily routine of survival developed its own grim rhythm. Morning, assess damage from night bombardment, repair positions, evacuate casualties. Midday, maximum danger period when German observers had best visibility. Stay underground, minimal movement. Afternoon, prepare for possible German patrol activity or limited attacks. Evening, rotate troops, move supplies under cover of approaching darkness. Night, improvement of positions, resupply, limited patrolling. Sleep came in shifts, never more than a few hours, always fully clothed with weapons within reach. Soldiers learned to sleep through distant artillery, but wake instantly at nearby explosions. The distinction between sleep and wakefulness blurred into a state of constant semi-consciousness, alert enough to react, but never truly resting. Rotation policies attempted to prevent complete psychological breakdown by cycling units between sectors. Frontline positions near German lines saw constant action, patrols, artillery duels, occasional small unit engagements. Secondary positions, a mile or two back, received less attention, but were still under artillery range. Rear areas, near the beach, were supposedly safe, but actually caught German long-range fire targeting the port. There was no genuinely safe sector, but some were safer than others. Units rotated every few weeks, giving men a change of scenery, if not actual rest. Some soldiers preferred frontline positions where they could at least shoot back. Others preferred rear areas, despite the randomness of artillery. All recognized that rotation was psychological more than practical. Death could find you anywhere in the beachhead. By late April, the beachhead had achieved equilibrium, a brutal, bloody equilibrium where both sides accepted the stalemate and focused on minimizing losses while maintaining positions. German forces settled into defensive routine, content to contain rather than destroy. Allied forces dug deeper, built stronger, and waited for strategic developments at Cassino to create breakout opportunities. The siege, for that's what Anzio had become, was sustainable indefinitely from a purely military standpoint. But the human cost of sustainability appeared in the eyes of soldiers who had lived underground for 3 months, who flinched at every sound, who no longer remembered what it felt like to be genuinely safe. They were alive, which was victory of sorts, But they were also damaged in ways that wouldn't show on casualty reports until years later, when nightmares and anxiety and inability to adjust to civilian life revealed the permanent scars Anzio carved into minds along with bodies. The beachhead held. The question was whether the men holding it would ever truly leave, even if their bodies eventually did. March 15th, 1944. The ground trembled 60 miles south of Anzio as 500 heavy bombers dropped 1,400 tons of explosives on Monte Cassino. Soldiers in the Anzio beachhead, standing in their foxholes, could hear the distant thunder rolling across the Pontine Plain like a sustained storm. Some climbed out of dugouts to watch the horizon, where smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the Italian sky. Word spread quickly through the beachhead. They're bombing Cassino, the monastery is coming down, Fifth Army is attacking. Maybe this time they'll break through. Maybe this time Anzio wouldn't be alone. The bombing continued for hours, the most concentrated aerial bombardment yet attempted in support of ground forces. It looked like Armageddon. It looked like nothing could survive. But when the dust cleared and infantry attacked, German paratroopers emerged from the rubble and fought just as effectively as before. The Third Battle of Cassino had begun, and it was failing. The strategic relationship between Anzio and Cassino had been clear from the beginning. The two battles were supposed to support each other, creating pressure that would crack German defenses at both points simultaneously. Land at Anzio, threaten German rear areas, force Kesselring to pull troops from the Gustav Line. Attack at Cassino, pin German reserves, prevent them from counterattacking the beachhead. Theoretical synergy that assumed both operations would succeed together. Instead, both had stalled separately. Cassino remained in German hands despite 3 massive offensives. Anzio remained contained despite initial landing success. The strategic link that should have created mutual advantage had become mutual irrelevance, each battle consuming resources independently, while achieving nothing except casualties. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, recognized that breaking the stalemate required coordination on a scale previously unattempted. By April, planning began for Operation Diadem, a massive offensive along the entire Italian front scheduled for May. Fifth Army would attack at Cassino with overwhelming force. British Eighth Army would attack along the Liri Valley. French Expeditionary Corps would attack through the mountains. Polish Corps would assault Monte Cassino directly. And when the Gustav Line cracked, when, not if, because this time failure was not acceptable, Sixth Corps would break out from Anzio, drive to Valmontone, and cut Highway 6, trapping German 10th Army as it retreated north. 4 separate attacks creating multiple breakthroughs that German reserves couldn't contain. It was ambitious, it was complex, it required perfect timing, and it was the only strategy left that offered hope of ending the Italian stalemate. The coordination challenge was immense. Armies separated by 60 miles had to attack in sequence. Cassino first to draw German attention and reserves, then Anzio 7 days later, when Germans were committed and unable to react. Communications between the fronts relied on radio and courier, both vulnerable to interception or delay. Weather affected everything. Rain made mountain attacks impossible. Cloudy skies prevented air support. Rough seas delayed supply ships to Anzio. The window for coordinated offensive operations in Italy was narrow, roughly May through early June, after spring mud dried, but before summer heat made combat in the mountains unbearable. Miss that window, and the campaign would drag into another year. Intelligence preparation for Diadem required understanding German dispositions across the entire front. Photo reconnaissance flights mapped every German position from the Tyrrhenian coast to the Adriatic. Signal intelligence intercepted German communications, piecing together order of battle and unit locations. Prisoner interrogations provided tactical details about morale, supplies, and defensive preparations. The picture that emerged was sobering. Kesselring commanded 23 divisions in Italy, approximately 430,000 men. 10 divisions held the Gustav Line. 9 divisions contained Anzio. The remainder provided reserves and defended rear areas. To achieve breakthrough, Allies would need local superiority of 3-1 or better, which meant concentrating overwhelming force at specific points while accepting weakness elsewhere. The Anzio component of Diadem received special attention because it represented the potential war-winning maneuver. 6th Corps, built up to 7 divisions by May, would attack towards Cisterna and Cori, then drive northeast to Valmontone. That town, sitting astride Highway 6, was the choke point through which German 10th Army had to retreat from Cassino. 6 Valmontone, block Highway 6, and potentially 5 to 7 German divisions could be trapped and destroyed. It was the envelopment that Anzio's landing was always supposed to create, delayed by 4 months, but finally achievable. Truscott, commanding 6th Corps, planned the operation meticulously. Axis of attack, reserve positions, logistics, everything. The plan designated Valmontone as the primary objective. That designation would prove temporary. Training for the breakout began in late April under conditions of strict security. Units rehearsed assault tactics in rear areas of the beachhead, as much as rear areas existed when the entire pocket was under German observation. Tank infantry coordination, river crossing techniques, rapid exploitation procedures, all practiced until automatic. Replacements arrived to bring depleted units back to strength. Ammunition stockpiles grew until supply officers worried about German artillery hitting the dumps. The beachhead, static for 3 months, was preparing to explode outward with violence that would make February's defensive battle look like a skirmish. Soldiers sensed the coming offensive, wrote letters home with vague references to big things ahead, and wondered whether they would survive to see Rome. Political pressure added urgency to military planning. Churchill demanded results in Italy before Overlord launched in Normandy. Stalin, at every Allied conference, questioned Western commitment to opening a real second front. American public opinion, reading casually reports from Italy with no visible progress, questioned why troops were still dying in what looked like a sideshow compared to the coming invasion of France. The Italian campaign, sold as a war-winning strategy, had become a strategic embarrassment. Only dramatic success, Rome captured, German armies destroyed, could vindicate the cost. Diadem carried that burden. It had to succeed not just militarily, but politically, demonstrating that the Italian campaign served a purpose beyond consuming Allied resources. The human element of waiting for the offensive appeared in the faces of soldiers who knew what was coming. Veterans of January's landing and February's defensive battle recognized that Breakout would mean casualties, maybe worse casualties than they had already suffered. New replacements, fresh from training, brought naive optimism that veterans found both touching and tragic. Officers, responsible for leading men into the assault, studied maps and wondered how many of their troops would survive. Chaplains conducted more services, heard more confessions, distributed more communion than in the previous months. Everyone knew the attack was coming. No one knew if they would survive it. The waiting became its own form of torture, anticipation and dread mixed into grinding anxiety. By early May, everything was ready except the signal to attack. That signal depended on events 60 miles south, where 5th Army prepared to storm positions it had failed to take 3 times before. At Cassino, the monastery ruins still held German paratroopers. The mountains still dominated every approach. The rivers still ran full with spring melt. But this time, overwhelming force would be applied. This time, French colonial troops would find paths through mountains British and American forces couldn't navigate. This time, Polish soldiers would storm the monastery with suicidal courage born of national desperation. Poland destroyed by both Germany and Russia, its exiled army fighting for honor when they had no country left to liberate. This time would be different. It had to be. Because if Cassino didn't fall, Anzio couldn't break out. And if Anzio couldn't break out, 4 months of siege, 19,000 casualties, and immeasurable suffering would have purchased nothing except a permanent beachhead leading nowhere. The synchronization between Cassino and Anzio, planned so carefully and delayed so long, would finally be tested. The answer would determine whether Italy became triumph or disaster. May 11th, 1944, 2300 hours. The Gustav Line erupted in fire as Operation Diadem began. 23 Allied divisions attacked simultaneously along a 25-mile front, from the Tyrrhenian coast to the mountains. 2,000 artillery pieces fired in the largest bombardment yet seen in Italy. French colonial troops infiltrated mountain trails. German defenders thought impassable. Polish forces began their assault on Monte Cassino's ruins. British Eighth Army pushed up the Liri Valley, and 60 miles north, in the Anzio beachhead, soldiers heard the distant thunder and knew their turn was coming. 7 days. That was the plan. Let the Gustav Line offensive draw German reserves south, commit them to defensive battle, then hit them from behind with Anzio's breakout. 7 days to wait, 7 days to prepare, 7 days to wonder if you would live through what was coming. May 22nd, night. Truscott assembled his commanders for final briefing on Operation Buffalo, the Anzio breakout. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. 500 artillery pieces would fire a short, violent preparation. Then 7 divisions, over 90,000 men, would attack on a 15-mile front from the Mussolini Canal in the east to the Moleta River in the west. Primary objective, Cisterna, the town that had destroyed the Rangers in January. Secondary objective, break through to Cori and the high ground beyond. Final objective, Valmontone, 20 miles from the beachhead, where Highway 6 could be cut and German 10th Army trapped. Truscott emphasized speed, aggression, exploitation. This wasn't defensive fighting anymore. This was offense, the role 6th Corps was always supposed to play. His final words to the assembled officers, "This is what we came here for. Don't stop until we reach Valmontone. May 23rd, 0545 hours. The beachhead exploded. 500 guns fired simultaneously, concentrating on German defensive positions across a 15-mile front. The bombardment made February's battles look restrained. Shells fell at rates exceeding 100 per minute in some sectors. German positions disappeared in smoke and flame. Counter-battery fire tried to suppress Allied artillery, but was overwhelmed by sheer volume. Offshore, cruisers added their 8-inch rifles to the chaos, dropping 120-pound shells on German assembly areas. The preparatory fire lasted 45 minutes, the longest preparation the beachhead had yet delivered. Then it stopped, and in the sudden silence, whistles blew and infantry climbed out of their foxholes. 0630 hours. The infantry assault began with 3rd Division attacking Cisterna from the south and southeast, 45th Division attacking from the west, 1st Armored Division providing mobile exploitation force. The German defenders, 4th Parachute Division, and elements of Hermann Göring Panzer Division had been expecting an attack. You can't hide preparations involving 90,000 men, but not the overwhelming violence that hit them. American infantry, supported by tanks firing at point-blank range, pushed into German positions. Small unit actions erupted across the entire front. Squads clearing bunkers, platoons seizing strong points, companies leapfrogging through prepared defenses. The tactics were standard, practiced 1,000 times. The execution was professional, veterans who knew their business against defenders who knew theirs. By noon, May 23rd, penetrations reached 3 to 4 miles deep in multiple sectors. Cisterna, that cursed town where Rangers had died in January, was surrounded. German defenders fought from the rubble, house to house, room to room. Tank destroyers positioned in basements fired at American Shermans in the streets. Snipers killed from church bell towers. But weight of numbers and firepower gradually compressed the defense. By evening, most of Cisterna was in American hands. German survivors retreated north or surrendered. The town that had seemed impregnable in January fell in one day of determined assault. The difference was overwhelming force applied correctly versus small units operating without support. Anzio had learned from its January failures. May 24th brought exploitation phase. 1st Armored Division, released through the gaps created by infantry, raced north toward Corey. Tank columns rolled through countryside that hadn't seen Allied forces since January. German rear area units, caught by surprise, fled or surrendered. Supply dumps were overrun. Communication centers destroyed. The breakthrough was real, momentum building, exploitation developing exactly as planned. By evening of the 24th, lead elements of 1st Armored were 12 miles from the beach, approaching Corey. Highway 7, the Via Appia, was within reach. Valmontone, the objective that would trap German 10th Army, lay just 8 miles beyond. 48 hours of breakthrough had achieved more than 3 months of siege. The plan was working. May 25th, afternoon. Truscott received new orders from Clark's 5th Army headquarters. The orders changed everything. Instead of continuing northeast toward the Valmontone, 6th Corps would pivot northwest toward Rome. The stated reason: opportunity to capture Rome before British 8th Army approaching from the southeast. The unstated reason: Clark's ambition to enter Rome first, to achieve the propaganda victory of liberating the First Axis capital, to claim glory for 5th Army and himself, personally. Truscott, reading the orders in disbelief, protested immediately. The Valmontone route would trap German divisions retreating from the broken Gustav line. The Rome route would let them escape. Military logic demanded Valmontone. Clark insisted on Rome. The argument between Truscott and Clark, conducted via radio and courier, revealed command dysfunction at the worst possible moment. Truscott emphasized that his corps was positioned perfectly to cut Highway 6 at Valmontone, that advance elements were already moving toward the objective, that German 10th Army was vulnerable and retreating. Clark responded that the British were approaching Rome from the south, that 5th Army deserved the honor of liberating the capital, that Truscott should execute orders instead of questioning them. Alexander, commanding over all Allied forces in Italy, had not authorized the change in plan. Clark was acting unilaterally, prioritizing political objective over military objective, choosing glory over strategic victory. Truscott, a professional soldier who valued obedience but also understood operational art, complied under protest. His diary entry for May 26th was bitter. "This may be a great day for Clark, but it's a terrible day for the war." May 26th and 27th saw 6th Corps pivot 45 degrees, changing axis of attack from northeast to northwest. The maneuver was impressive from a logistics standpoint, moving 90,000 men and their equipment 90 degrees while maintaining combat operations. But it surrendered the operational advantage. German 10th Army, retreating north from Cassino through the Liri Valley, used Highway 6 to escape. The trap at Valmontone that should have closed on May 27th remained open. German divisions that could have been destroyed instead retreated intact to fight again at the Gothic line. The estimate from intelligence officers, 5 to 7 divisions, approximately 70,000 men, escaped encirclement because 6th Corps pivoted toward Rome instead of Valmontone. The tactical success of Buffalo couldn't disguise the strategic disappointment. In 5 days, 6th Corps advanced 20 miles, destroyed the Caesar Line defenses, captured Cisterna and Corey, and broke the siege that had imprisoned it since January. Casualties were remarkably light, 2,800 killed and wounded, compared to February's defensive battle. German casualties exceeded 4,500, with thousands more captured when positions were overrun. From a military standpoint, it was a brilliant operation, executed with skill and courage. From a strategic standpoint, it was opportunity wasted. The breakout succeeded, but the envelopment failed. Germans escaped. The Italian campaign, instead of ending with dramatic destruction of enemy forces, would continue for another year as German armies retreated slowly north, fighting delaying actions all the way. The price of Clark's ambition measured in months of continued war. The soldiers conducting Buffalo had no visibility into command-level decisions. They fought, advanced, seized objectives as ordered. When the axis changed from northeast to northwest, They adjusted and continued attacking. Their perspective was tactical. Take the next hill, clear the next town, survive the next firefight. The strategic implications of pivoting toward Rome instead of Valmontone meant nothing to a rifleman clearing a bunker or a tank crew engaging enemy armor. They did their jobs superbly. The breakout worked because soldiers at company and battalion level executed with professional competence. If the operation ultimately failed to achieve its full potential, that failure belonged to generals making decisions in headquarters, not troops bleeding in the field. Buffalo proved 6th Corps could break out of Anzio any time it had sufficient force. The tragedy was that it took 4 months to assemble that force, and when the breakout finally came, the opportunity it created was deliberately squandered for personal glory. The men who died in May died bravely. Whether they died usefully remained an open and painful question. May 30th, 1944. Velletri, a hilltop town in the Alban Hills that had loomed over the beachhead for 4 months like a threat, finally fell to American assault. The 36th Division, advancing from the south and west, fought through German rearguards in brutal street combat. Every building was contested. Every street corner became a sniper's nest. German defenders, mostly from the 362nd Infantry Division, fought delaying actions with professional skill, hold a position until threatened with encirclement, then withdraw to the next defensible line. The pattern repeated house by house, block by block. By evening, Velletri belonged to the Americans, and from its heights, soldiers could see Rome itself, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, visible 20 miles north. The objective that had seemed impossible in January appeared suddenly achievable in May. The race toward Rome accelerated on June 1st as German resistance weakened from determined defense to sporadic delaying actions. Kesselring had made his decision. Rome would not be defended. The city, declared an open city to preserve its historical and religious treasures, would be evacuated. German forces would retreat north of the Tiber River, establish new defensive lines, and continue the war from there. The decision was strategic, political, and pragmatic. Defending Rome street by street would destroy the city and create propaganda disaster. Better to withdraw intact, preserve forces for future battles, and claim moral high ground by sparing Rome destruction. Hitler acquiesced reluctantly. He wanted every inch of Italy defended to the death. But even Hitler understood that Rome's rubble served no military purpose. June 2nd brought increased tempo as multiple Allied units converged on Rome from different directions. 6th Corps from Anzio pushed northwest through Albano and Genzano. 5th Army elements from Cassino advanced from the south. British 8th Army approached from the southeast. It had become a race not against Germans, but between Allied units, each wanting to claim the honor of liberating Rome first. Clark, commanding 5th Army, was determined his forces would win that race. He issued explicit orders. American units would enter Rome before British units, period. The rivalry between American and British commanders, never far below the surface, emerged blatantly. Montgomery's 8th Army had carried much of the fighting in North Africa and Sicily. Clark wanted 5th Army to get credit for Italy's biggest prize. German rearguard actions on June 2nd and 3rd demonstrated professional withdrawal techniques. Small units, company-sized battle groups with anti-tank guns and machine guns, occupied key terrain controlling approaches to Rome. They would hold until Allied forces deployed for attack, then withdraw before becoming encircled. The tactic delayed Allied advance without risking forces in static defense. Bridges were demolished after the last German vehicle crossed. Roads were mined or blocked with debris. The retreating Germans weren't running. They were conducting textbook delaying action, making Allies pay time, if not blood, for every mile. Allied casualties remained light because Germans weren't trying to hold permanently, just slow the pursuit. June 4th, 0400 hours. Lead elements of 5th Army's 88th Division entered Rome from the south. The first Allied troops to enter the city were met by civilians emerging from homes, waving, cheering, offering wine and flowers. Italian resistance fighters, who had operated underground during German occupation, appeared with weapons and armbands, claiming credit for Rome's liberation. Collaborators and fascists disappeared into cellars and back alleys, hoping to escape retribution. By mid-morning, American jeeps were rolling through Rome's streets, soldiers gawking at the Colosseum, the Forum, the historic monuments they had seen in textbooks. War correspondents scrambled to file stories. Photographers captured images of liberation, GIs surrounded by cheering Romans, flags waving, joy replacing fear. June 4th, noon. Clark held a press conference at the Capitoline Hill. Flanked by American flags and surrounded by reporters, his statement was carefully prepared. "This is a great day for the Fifth Army and for the whole Allied force in Italy. We have driven the enemy out of Rome." He emphasized American achievement, Fifth Army's sacrifice, the victory's significance. What he didn't mention, the German divisions that escaped because Sixth Corps pivoted toward Rome instead of Valmontone. What he didn't mention, Alexander's disapproval of the decision. What he didn't mention, that Rome, while symbolically important, was militarily less valuable than destroying German combat power. Clark got his moment of glory, photographers immortalizing him as Rome's liberator. Whether liberation without destruction of the enemy constituted genuine victory was a question that would haunt his legacy. The world's reaction to Rome's liberation was enthusiastic but brief. Newspapers worldwide ran front-page stories on June 4th. Rome falls, Allies liberate First Axis capital. Clark's Fifth Army enters Rome in triumph. The propaganda value was real, proof that Axis powers could be defeated, their capitals captured, their empires dismantled. For a few hours, Rome dominated global attention. Then, June 5th editions arrived with bigger news. Overlord had launched. Allied forces were landing in Normandy. The invasion of France had begun. Rome's liberation, the culmination of 4 months at Anzio and 9 months in Italy, was relegated to page 3. The Italian campaign, always a strategic sideshow despite the blood spilled, had become literally an afterthought. D-Day overshadowed everything. The civilians of Rome experienced liberation with mixed emotions. Joy at German departure was real. Occupation had brought hunger, fear, and arbitrary violence. But liberation also brought new occupiers, different uniforms, but still foreign armies. Allied military government would replace German administration. Food shortages would continue because supply systems were disrupted. Buildings damaged and the fighting needed repair. And Rome's position directly behind the new front lines meant continued danger from German artillery and possible counterattack. Liberation was better than occupation, but it wasn't the immediate paradise civilians had imagined. Freedom, they discovered, didn't mean safety or prosperity, just the absence of one particular form of oppression. The fate of German 10th Army, escaping via Highway 6 while 6th Corps pivoted toward Rome, revealed the operation's strategic failure. Intelligence estimates suggested that 7 German divisions, approximately 70,000 men, retreated intact through Valmontone and north toward the Gothic line. These formations, battered by Cassino but not destroyed, depleted but functional, would man defensive positions across northern Italy for another year. If 6th Corps had reached Valmontone on May 27th as originally planned, those divisions might have been trapped between Allied forces from Anzio and Allied forces pursuing from Cassino. Destroyed or captured divisions can't defend future positions. Escaped divisions can reorganize, reinforce, and fight again. Clark's decision to prioritize Rome over Valmontone extended the Italian campaign by months, cost additional Allied casualties, and allowed Germany to continue defending Italy with forces that should have been eliminated. June 5th, as attention shifted to Normandy, the soldiers who had fought from Anzio to Rome assessed what they had achieved. They had landed behind enemy lines in January, survived German counteroffensive in February, endured 3 months of siege, broken out in May, covered 60 miles in 2 weeks of pursuit, liberated Rome on June 4th. They had done everything asked of them with courage and competence. But what had it accomplished? Italy was still at war, Germans were still fighting, now from the Gothic Line. The campaign would continue into 1945, consuming more lives for minimal strategic gain. The soldiers didn't know all this. Command-level strategic failures weren't visible from foxholes. They knew they had survived Anzio, which was victory enough. They knew Rome was liberated, which was something. And they knew that whatever came next, it couldn't be worse than the beachhead. On that last point, at least, they were right. Anzio was over. The question was what its cost had purchased. June 1944. Medical officers across Italy compiled final casualty statistics from the Anzio campaign. The numbers, recorded in official reports and personal journals, told a story more brutal than any individual battle narrative. From January 22nd through June 4th, 125 days, Allied forces at Anzio suffered approximately 59,000 casualties. 7,000 killed in action, 36,000 wounded, 16,000 missing or captured, most of whom were casualties from failed offenses or German counterattacks. The daily casualty rate averaged 472 men. More than a battalion destroyed every single day for 4 months. These weren't just statistics. They were sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. 59,000 families received telegrams that changed their lives forever. The breakdown by nationality revealed how multinational the suffering was. American casualties totaled 33,000. The bulk of forces at Anzio were American. So American families bore the bulk of grief. British casualties reached 24,000, including Canadians serving in British formations. The remainder, roughly 2,000, came from other Allied nations. Free French, Poles fighting under British command, even a few Brazilians in specialized units. Each casualty represented not just a person, but a network of people affected. Parents who would never see their child again. Wives who became widows. Children who would grow up without fathers. The arithmetic of war is cold. The human cost is infinite. Psychiatric casualties from Anzio reached unprecedented percentages. In some battalions during February's fighting, combat fatigue cases accounted for 30 to 35% of total casualties, surpassing any previous American battle. The sustained artillery bombardment, the inescapable danger, the months of living underground with constant death. It broke men in ways visible wounds didn't. Medical staff developed a grim ability to predict which soldiers would break. 1,000-yard stare. Exaggerated startle response. Withdrawal from comrades. These were warning signs that a soldier's mind was approaching collapse. Some could be rotated to rear areas for rest, maybe recover. Others broke completely, requiring evacuation and long-term psychiatric treatment that 1940s medicine barely understood. The types of physical wounds reflected the nature of Anzio combat. Artillery and mortar fragments caused approximately 60 to 70% of casualties. High explosive shells that killed with blast, shrapnel, or both. Machine gun fire and rifle bullets caused another 20%. Mines accounted for perhaps 5%. Though these injuries were often catastrophic, legs blown off, multiple amputations, injuries so severe that survival itself was questionable. The remaining percentage came from various causes: accidents, friendly fire, disease, non-combat injuries. Combat surgeons learned to assess wounds with brutal efficiency. Will this soldier live? Will he ever fight again? Will he even walk again? Triage decisions made in seconds determined who received immediate treatment versus who was made comfortable to die. German casualties from Anzio totaled approximately 40,000 over the same period. 5,000 killed, 30,000 wounded, 5,000 captured. The ratio, German to Allied casualties roughly 2 to 3, reflected several realities. Germans held defensive positions for most of the campaign, and defense typically costs fewer casualties than offense. German artillery on high ground was more effective than Allied artillery on flat ground, but German medical care was inferior to Allied care. Wounded Germans often received treatment hours later than wounded Allies. increasing mortality from wounds that should have been survivable. German prisoners, when questioned, described medical facilities overwhelmed, surgery performed without anesthesia when supplies ran low, wards full of men dying from infections that Allied penicillin could have treated. The comparative cost analysis revealed Anzio's toll relative to other operations. Normandy's D-Day, June 6, 1944, cost approximately 10,000 Allied casualties in 24 hours. Horrific, but concentrated. Anzio cost 59,000 over 125 days. Less dramatic, but sustained grinding death. The average daily loss rate at Anzio exceeded Normandy's average across the entire Normandy campaign's first 3 months. Anzio was, statistically, one of the most casualty-intensive operations of the European War when measured by daily loss rate relative to forces engaged. The Beachhead swallowed men at rates comparable to the worst battles of World War I. Unit destruction through the replacement system created a peculiar horror. The 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division, serves as example. The regiment's authorized strength was approximately 3,000 men. During Anzio, it suffered casualties exceeding 12,000, 400% losses, meaning the entire regiment was replaced 4 times over. A soldier who landed in January and survived until June would look around and literally not recognize anyone. All his original comrades were dead, wounded, or evacuated for combat fatigue. The unit maintained continuity through organization and leadership, but the men changed completely. This created psychological dislocation. No institutional memory, no veteran core, just constant influx of replacements who died before becoming veterans themselves. Medical facilities, from frontline aid stations to hospital ships, evolved into efficient trauma management systems. The typical casualties journey, wounded in combat, treated by unit medic who stopped bleeding and administered morphine, evacuated by litter bearers to battalion aid station, moved by ambulance to field hospital in the Beachhead, surgery if necessary, then evacuation by hospital ship to Naples or beyond. The system saved lives. Mortality rates for wounded at Anzio were lower than comparable World War I battles, despite worse initial wounds. Blood transfusions, sulfa drugs to prevent infection, improved surgical techniques, rapid evacuation, all contributed to survival. Still, thousands died from wounds that today would be survivable. Medicine in 1944 was better than 1914, but primitive compared to modern standards. The long-term disabilities created by Anzio would affect veterans for decades. Amputees numbered in the thousands, legs blown off by mines, arms shattered by shell fire, multiple limbs lost in catastrophic explosions. These men face futures in wheelchairs or with primitive prosthetics that barely functioned. Blindness from head wounds or blast effects, deafness from artillery, traumatic brain injuries that left men functional but changed, different personalities, impaired judgment, memory problems, and psychiatric damage that wouldn't be diagnosed as PTSD for another generation. Men who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who couldn't tolerate loud noises, who couldn't adjust to civilian life after spending 4 months in hell. The families left behind faced their own casualties. War widows, some very young, raising children alone without their husbands. Parents who buried sons, the natural order reversed in the cruelest way. Siblings who grew up with empty chairs at dinner tables. The financial impact compounded the emotional. Widows lost breadwinners. Disability pensions rarely covered actual costs. Medical care for the severely wounded, bankrupted families. The government provided some support, but 1940s social services were minimal. Families coped or didn't, grieved or grew bitter, moved forward or remained trapped in loss. The casualties didn't end when soldiers died. They rippled outward through families and communities for generations. By late summer 1944, as Sicily, Rome, American Cemetery received its first burials and hospital ships continued evacuating wounded, the question everyone asked was simple. Was it worth it? 59,000 Allied casualties purchased Rome's liberation, tied down German divisions that couldn't oppose Normandy, demonstrated Allied ability to conduct complex amphibious operations, and proved that beachheads could survive against determined counterattacks. But Rome could have been reached by different means. German divisions tied down at Anzio might have been destroyed rather than merely contained. The landing could have broken out in January rather than waiting until May. The price paid exceeded the value received by any reasonable accounting. Truscott, reflecting years later, called Anzio a soldier's battle, brilliantly fought at tactical level, but strategically compromised by decisions above that level. The men who died at Anzio died bravely. Whether they died usefully, whether their sacrifice achieved objectives worthy of their cost, remained a question without comfortable answer. The butcher's bill came due. Payment was made in full. What was purchased remained disputed. 1948. Winston Churchill sat in his study at Chartwell, writing his memoirs of the Second World War. The chapter on Italy required particular care. This was his strategic brainchild, his soft underbelly theory, his Anzio operation. History would judge, and Churchill was keenly aware that history's judgment might not be kind. He wrote carefully, "The Anzio landing was a correct strategic concept, poorly executed at the tactical level. Translation? The idea was brilliant, the generals bungled it." He specifically criticized Lucas for excessive caution in the first days, arguing that immediate advance to the Alban Hills would have achieved breakthrough. What Churchill couldn't write without damning himself, was that the operation was fundamentally flawed. Insufficient forces for the mission, unrealistic timelines, competing objectives, command confusion. The Prime Minister defended his vision by blaming its execution, a politician's move rather than a historian's honesty. 1950. General John Lucas, retired and in declining health, gave his final interview about Anzio. He spoke without bitterness, but with obvious pain. "I was given an impossible mission with inadequate forces and blamed for not achieving miracles." He defended his January decisions. Consolidating the beachhead prevented disaster. Advancing prematurely would have led to encirclement and destruction. He noted that Truscott, who replaced him, pursued essentially the same defensive strategy for 3 months before the May breakout. The difference was that Truscott had time, and I didn't. I became a scapegoat for an operation compromised from conception. Lucas died in 1954, never publicly blaming Clark or Churchill, but privately convinced that history would eventually vindicate his caution. History hasn't. The image of Lucas as the general who hesitated when boldness was needed has persisted, fair or not. 1951. Lucian Truscott published his memoirs, Command Missions, which included detailed criticism of the decision to pivot toward Rome instead of Valmontone. His assessment was blunt. Had we turned east toward Valmontone as planned, we could have trapped and destroyed the German 10th Army. Clark's decision to go for Rome allowed those divisions to escape and fight another year. It was the right decision politically, but the wrong decision militarily. Truscott stopped short of calling it insubordination. Clark was his superior, but the implication was clear. Personal ambition had overridden operational logic. Rome's capture made headlines for a day. German divisions that escaped fought at the Gothic line for 10 more months, causing thousands of additional Allied casualties. The glory was Clark's, the cost was everyone else's. 1958. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, in post-war interviews from his German home, offered the enemy's perspective on Anzio. The landing was extremely dangerous and caught us completely by surprise. If the Allies had advanced aggressively on the 22nd and 23rd of January, they could have taken the Alban Hills and possibly reached Rome before we could react. Instead, they gave us time to assemble forces and contain the threat. The beachhead was poorly exploited. The breakout in May was well executed but directed toward the wrong objective. Clark's decision to go for Rome instead of Valmontone was a gift. We were vulnerable to encirclement, and he chose publicity instead. Kesselring's assessment, from the man who defeated Anzio, carried weight. The enemy recognized the missed opportunity, even if Allied commanders disputed it. The strategic achievement debate centered on whether tying down German divisions justified Anzio's cost. Proponents argued 9 German divisions contained around Anzio meant 9 divisions that couldn't oppose Overlord in Normandy. Hitler's obsession with eliminating the beachhead diverted resources from France at a critical time. The Italian campaign, while slow and costly, kept German forces committed to a secondary theater. Anzio specifically forced Germany to maintain approximately 135,000 troops around a beachhead that ultimately broke out and contributed to Rome's liberation. By these measures, Anzio succeeded. It fixed German forces, created strategic dilemma, and eventually achieved its objective of unhinging the Gustav Line. Critics countered with equally compelling arguments. Those 9 divisions around Anzio came mostly from Italy itself, pulled from the Gustav Line or Italian rear areas, not from France. The landing craft and resources devoted to Anzio could have been used for earlier, larger Normandy invasion or operations elsewhere. Rome could have been reached by conventional advance once the Gustav Line broke at Cassino. Anzio wasn't necessary for Rome's capture. The beachhead, far from unhinging German defenses, became static siege that consumed Allied resources for 4 months. 59,000 casualties purchased a city that would have fallen anyway, and temporarily tied down divisions that escaped to fight again. By these measures, Anzio failed. It cost more than it achieved, diverted resources from more important operations, and demonstrated the limits of ambitious amphibious end runs. The timeline impact raised particular controversy. Rome fell on June 4th, 2 days before Normandy. Churchill had wanted Italian success before Overlord to demonstrate Allied momentum. Rome's liberation on June 4th technically achieved that, providing positive headlines before D-Day's uncertain outcome. But the timing was coincidental rather than planned. Overlord's date had been set months earlier, based on moon and tide conditions. Rome's capture influenced nothing about Normandy except morale, and the news cycle showed the irrelevance. Rome dominated headlines for fewer than 24 hours before Normandy overshadowed it completely. If Rome was the prize justifying Anzio's cost, it was a prize that mattered for one day. The counterfactual questions haunted military historians for decades. What if Lucas had attacked on January 22nd? Intelligence suggested Highway 7 and the Alban Hills were undefended for 48 hours. An aggressive thrust might have seized commanding terrain before Germans could react, or it might have advanced into a trap, with extended supply lines vulnerable to German counterattack, leading to encirclement and disaster worse than what actually occurred. Without knowing German reaction times and reserve positioning precisely, the counterfactual remains speculation. What if Clark had pursued Valmontone instead of Rome? Intelligence estimates suggested 5 to 7 German divisions could have been trapped. But trapped doesn't mean destroyed. German forces might have broken through encirclement or been rescued by counterattacks. Again, speculation based on imperfect information. The comparison to other amphibious operations provided context. Normandy succeeded through overwhelming force, 150,000 men in the initial assault versus Anzio's 36,000. Normandy had air superiority and massive naval support. Anzio had limited air support and naval gunfire vulnerable to German shore batteries. Sicily succeeded through rapid exploitation, armored columns racing across terrain favorable to mobile warfare. Anzio's flat coastal plain was favorable to defense, unfavorable to exploitation. The most successful amphibious operations combined surprise, overwhelming force, rapid exploitation, and geography favoring offense. Anzio had surprise but lacked the other elements. Comparing it to Normandy or Sicily highlighted Anzio's fundamental disadvantages. The legacy question remained: how should history judge an operation where courage exceeded planning, where tactical success couldn't overcome strategic confusion, where soldiers performed brilliantly but commanders compromised their achievement? Anzio was simultaneously success and failure, vindication, and disaster, necessary and wasteful. It succeeded as a landing, one of WW2's most successful in terms of casualties during the assault phase. It failed as a breakout. The window of opportunity closed due to caution or prudence, depending on interpretation. It succeeded as containment. The beachhead held despite German offensive. It failed as strategy. The costs exceeded the gains by most reasonable accounting. 60 years of historical analysis produced no consensus. Anzio remained contested battlefield, not just in 1944, but in memory, interpretation, and legacy. The only certainty was that 59,000 Allied casualties and 40,000 German casualties deserved better than the strategic confusion that characterized their sacrifice. January 22, 1969, 25th anniversary of the landing. Elderly men, some walking with canes, others in wheelchairs, gathered on the beaches of Anzio, where they had waded ashore as young soldiers. The Italian government had organized commemorations, speeches, wreaths, memorial ceremonies. But for the veterans, the ceremonies mattered less than simply being there. Standing on sand they remembered from different context. One veteran, former private in 3rd Division, walked to the spot where his landing craft had beached. He knelt, touched the sand, and wept. When asked later what he was thinking, he said, "I was remembering the men who didn't leave. They're still here, all of them, in the ground and in the memory. I came back so they wouldn't be alone." The beach, quiet and peaceful in 1969, held ghosts only veterans could see. The Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, established 1946 near Nettuno, held 7,860 American war dead. The cemetery sat on 77 acres of land donated by Italy, overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. White marble crosses and stars of David stood in perfect rows, each marking a fallen soldier. The tablets of the missing bore 3,095 names, men whose bodies were never recovered, lost to artillery, buried in collapsed bunkers, or lost at sea. The chapel, with its mosaic ceiling depicting angels, offered space for reflection. Families came from America to visit graves, placing flowers, leaving photographs, maintaining connection with sons and husbands who never came home. The cemetery was beautiful and heartbreaking, organized with military precision, maintained with reverence, housing men who died far from home. 1984 saw the 40th anniversary commemorations with increased Italian participation. The post-war generation, born after liberation, recognized that American soldiers had died to free their country from fascism. Italian officials, veterans organizations, and schools participated in memorial events. Italian children placed flowers on American graves. The mayor of Anzio declared the anniversary a civic holiday. One Italian veteran of the resistance, speaking at the ceremony, said, "These men came from across the ocean to fight for people they'd never met, for a country that wasn't theirs. They died in our soil so we could be free. We owe them memory." The reconciliation was complete. Former enemies united in remembering shared suffering, recognizing that soldiers on both sides had been victims of decisions made by others. 1994 brought the 50th anniversary, likely the last major reunion for most veterans. Fewer than 100 Anzio veterans attended. Age and health had thinned their ranks. They were in their 70s and 80s now, grandfathers who rarely spoke about the war to their families, but would share stories with fellow veterans. The reunion included tours of the battlefield, now farmland again, with occasional pillboxes visible in fields. They visited the caves where they had lived, smaller than remembered but still there. They stood at the Anzio overpass, that bowling alley where so many had died, now a modern highway with no trace of war. And they talked, late into the night, about men who never grew old, about fear and courage and the randomness of death, about what it meant to survive when so many didn't. The Anzio Beachhead Museum, opened in 1994, preserved artifacts and memories in a building near the port. Displays included uniforms, weapons, photographs, personal items recovered from the battlefield. One exhibit featured letters written by soldiers, never sent, because the authors died before mail call. Another showed the daily ration allocations, the medical instruments used in field surgery, the crude tools soldiers used to dig foxholes in volcanic tufa. The museum's mission was educational, teaching new generations about events that shaped their country, preserving memory as living witnesses died. Italian schoolchildren visited on field trips, trying to comprehend a history that seemed impossibly distant despite occurring in their hometown. Survivor testimonies, collected through oral history projects, revealed common themes. Brotherhood, the bonds formed in combat, exceeded anything in civilian life. Waste, the senseless nature of deaths that achieve so little strategically. Bravery, men doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. Questioning, decades later, still wondering if it was worth it, if their friends died for something meaningful or merely for political objectives. Guilt, survivor's guilt, the feeling that those who died were better men, that survival was accident rather than merit. And silence, the difficulty explaining to people who weren't there what it was actually like, the impossibility of conveying horror to those who had never experienced it. The last major reunion occurred in 2004, 60th anniversary. Only a handful of veterans could travel. The youngest were in their late 70s, most in their 80s. They arrived in wheelchairs more often than walking. Their memories were sometimes confused, conflating different battles or misremembering dates. But the emotional memory remained sharp. They could describe exactly how they felt when landing craft doors opened, the terror of artillery bombardment, the face of a friend who died beside them. Younger family members accompanied them, recording stories, taking photographs, trying to preserve something of that experience before the last witnesses died. The veterans knew this would be their final visit. They said goodbye to Anzio, to the ghosts, to their younger selves. 2019 saw the death of the last known Anzio veteran, marking the transition from living memory to history. His obituary appeared in newspapers, noting his age, 95, his service, landed January 22nd, wounded February 17th, returned to duty March 4th, and his post-war life, carpenter, father of 4, rarely spoke about the war. With his death, Anzio passed from experienced reality to documented history. No one remained who could say, "I was there," and describe it from personal knowledge. The archives, museums, cemeteries, and memorials continued preserving memory, but it was fundamentally different. Curated memory rather than lived memory, history rather than experience. The physical battlefield, by the 21st century, showed minimal traces of 1944. Anzio and Nettuno had grown into prosperous beach towns, popular with Roman tourists. The port handled commercial shipping. High-rise apartments occupied land where soldiers had died. Farmland covered former battlefields. Occasional bunkers remained, mostly overgrown and forgotten, except by local historians. The caves where men lived were mostly sealed for safety. Highway 7, the bowling alley, was a modern motorway with no indication that crossing it once meant death. The landscape had healed, moved on, forgotten. Only the cemetery and museum maintained memory, and even there, visitors were often tourists who spent 15 minutes before heading to the beach. The lessons of Anzio, debated by military historians, centered on the challenges of amphibious operations behind enemy lines. Surprise is crucial, but temporary. Exploitation must be immediate, or the window closes. Sufficient force matters more than boldness. No amount of courage compensates for inadequate troops. Command clarity prevents disaster. Unclear objectives and conflicting orders doom operations regardless of tactical skill. Political objectives must align with military reality. Going for glory over strategic victory extends wars and costs lives. The lessons seemed clear in hindsight. They had been equally clear to some commanders in 1944. The problem wasn't knowledge, but judgment, not information, but decision-making. Military history teaches lessons. Human nature determines whether anyone learns them. The final question, the one veterans asked themselves in quiet moments and historians debated in academic journals, was existential. What did we owe the men who died at Anzio? Remember them, certainly, The cemetery, museum, and memorials did that. Honor their courage. The ceremonies and medals acknowledge that. But was memory enough? Did we owe them more? Perhaps the obligation to ensure their sacrifice achieved something lasting, that the freedom they fought for was preserved, that future generations didn't repeat the mistakes that cost their lives? The veterans who survived carried that obligation with them, sometimes consciously, more often as unnamed weight. They had lived while friends died, and that created debt that couldn't be repaid except through living well, serving others, maybe preventing future young men from facing similar slaughter. As the 21st century progressed and the last Anzio veterans died, the ghosts remained. Not supernatural spirits, but memory ghosts. The echo of 59,000 casualties, the weight of sacrifice, the questions about whether it was worth it. The beaches were peaceful now, the caves empty, the fighting positions overgrown. But the ghosts were there in cemetery rows, in museum exhibits, in the occasional nightmare of elderly men who once were young and terrified. Anzio became history, studied by students, analyzed by scholars, commemorated by governments. But for those who experienced it, it remained something else, a scar that never fully healed, a memory that time softened but never erased, a question that decades couldn't answer. What was it for? The men who died couldn't answer. The men who survived couldn't answer comfortably. And history, for all its analysis and hindsight, could only note that Anzio happened, cost terribly, achieved ambiguously, and left ghosts that would never fully rest. The landing was perfect, the battle was hell. The legacy was complicated, and the debt to those who died there remained unpaid and unpayable, acknowledged only through memory, and the obligation to ensure their sacrifice meant something, even if we couldn't always articulate what.